This is where Jordan Peterson would make a distinction between propaganda and art. And this is also in Robert Anton Wilson's terms, you make the same point. This is where circuit 3 and circuit 4 can devour circuit 6. So you get situations where if I'm like, I really think society should accept gay people more, I'm going to make a piece of fiction that has that message, the central message, like people should accept gay people more. And I'm going to have these 2 gay people and they're going to be oppressed by the evil religious people, and then this and this and this is going to happen. Maybe they'll be lions. Like I can bring in circuit 6 elements, but circuit 4 is the one that's in charge and running the show. And so basically circuit 4 is like exploiting circuit 6 to produce this piece of propaganda that I'll call art. You are tuning in to the Multiversity, a podcast for higher dimensional education.
Join us as we explore philosophy, science, history, and the great unknown.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Multiversity Project. Today, we are going to be talking about accessing and mastering higher states of consciousness or higher circuits of consciousness. These past few episodes, we've been going through Timothy Leary and Robert Anton Wilson's 8-circuit model of consciousness, which basically is like a stacking model talking about everything from our basic survival functions all the way up to union with the divine. And in this episode, we're going to be talking specifically about the last 4 circuits of consciousness, which have to do with our mind-body connection, getting in contact with universal archetypes, metaprogramming, reprogramming our brains, our personalities, and our thought processes, and potentially communing with something greater outside of ourselves. If you haven't checked out our other episodes, I highly recommend that you do that. That's going to be a much better introduction to the 8 circuits, but we have designed this episode in such a way that you should be able to understand what we're talking about, even if you haven't watched those episodes. But this is specifically going to be focused on how do we get to these higher circuits of consciousness. So thank you for joining us, and I hope you enjoy the ride.
So the first one we're going to be talking about is circuit 5, the neuro-somatic circuit. So neuro means brain, somatic means feeling. And that's what this circuit is all about. It's about connecting the brain with the feelings of the body. And it's, you think like bliss states, ecstasy, like the state of being in ecstasy. This is associated with the placebo effect, like being so in touch with your body that you're able to, in some ways, transcend health problems and stuff like that. So this is an interesting circuit. And there are a few different ways people have talked about to reach it. Some of those are through ecstatic dancing, cannabis, Kundalini yoga, extreme fitness, like running or extreme sports, martial arts, nutrition, diet, tantric sex, BDSM, pranayama, faith healing, music, maybe music festivals, MDMA, shamanism, psychosis, creative pursuits, traveling, sensory deprivation tanks, oxygen tanks, going to the spa, and those are a few. So before we get into the deep discussion, do you guys I just listed a whole bunch of stuff. Do you guys want to, are there any of them that you guys want to comment on or that particularly you've had interesting experiences with?
I mean, yeah, I've had interesting experiences with at least 75% of the things that you just said. The list that you just read off reminds me of the book Stealing Fire, where they talk about all of the different ways to get into the flow state and extreme sports and drugs and music festivals and these experiences that kind of put your mind into this just like kind of slightly anxious, but also blissful state are kind of replete throughout that book. Yeah, no, it's a great state. I love Circuit 5.
Visit there every summer.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to many of the things that you just listed. Cannabis is a big one, and that's one that Robert Anton Wilson talks about a lot in terms of the state. But I feel like using cannabis, unless you're getting into a paranoid state or something bad, will almost automatically put you into this state where sensations are more real. You have that mind-body connection, kind of the flow state like Chris was talking about. So that's definitely a big one. And I guess MDMA would be like that too. an extreme degree. Side note, like not recommending that anybody utilize any illegal substances. But yeah, one thing that I thought that was interesting on that list that isn't so common was psychosis. That's not something that I would usually think about in terms of connecting with a higher state of consciousness. But what do you guys think about that?
I have some experience with that. I do remember when I was in my little fantasy time that I had, or my my little diversion from ordinary states of mind when I was 17, and there were things that would happen. I guess that if you wanted to get into it psychiatrically, people would also call this mania and stuff like that. But there would be times when I would have enough control over my emotions where I could just think, okay, I want to enter into a state of extreme happiness or extreme love or something like that, and it would happen. So that definitely relates.
So you felt like you had more control over your state while you were in mania or psychosis than during regular times?
Yes, absolutely. So I could become happy or full of love at will. Or, also negative emotions like fear or terror. I could summon those emotions within myself as well.
What did it feel like to be in psychosis?
Well, it's a very broad question. I mean, I wouldn't, I don't normally use that term psychosis because I think it's a misnomer. But if it was over a period of several months, like maybe 3 or 6 months, and there's a lot of emotions involved, but part of it was about letting go of my previous preconceptions, which is, in a way, that's something kind of cool, and that's kind of why people take psychedelic drugs. But that's also a problem because if you don't have some kind of framework or a mentor, somebody to show you the ropes, like, okay, so you've let go of everything. Now what do you do? I got into a lot of trouble with that. But emotionally, it was very interesting because I could reach these very extreme states of consciousness at will.
How do you know that what was happening with you is like the same state that other people define as psychosis?
Good. And I don't think it is. In a lot of cases, but that was how they diagnosed me, and that's why, I say it's a misnomer. I think it would be a misnomer in my case. I think in other people's cases, it might also be a misnomer. But I mean, probably every case of psychosis has similarities. My case certainly had similarities to other people's cases. So. Like the psychologist would give me these tracts talking about, say, a case where somebody became obsessed with the NSA trying to hack into his brain or something like that, and he would find a seashell, and this seashell he believed had a microphone that the NSA was using to track him or something like that, and then in the end he broke it open and there was nothing in that. So this is the kind of paranoid delusions that somebody in this kind of fragile mind state can have. And that was similar to things that I experienced.
So it sounds like, though, that you had a very large degree of control over your experience, where, like you said, that you could enter certain emotions at will. It seems like to me that a lot of times when people enter these kind of altered states, they're not really necessarily in control of the experience. And I think that's where a lot of the sort of fear and terror comes from when people enter these states. They feel like the experience is being thrust upon them. Yeah, instead of being able to kind of steer it, like you said you could. So that's kind of
there's a very complex relationship. Like when we say control, we actually mean several things. So if you give somebody $1 million, in a sense, they have a lot of control because they have power. They can buy things from people. They can even force people to humiliate themselves or something like that. But that doesn't mean they have self-control. that doesn't mean they can do really what is in alignment with their own best interests or their own moral code or something like that. They might be seduced by this kind of power. So there's control, and then there's control. You know, he who controls others is strong, but he who controls himself is mighty indeed.
So would you say that when you had these experiences that you were accessing or maybe learning how to access your fifth circuit?
Yes.
I was wondering could you tell a little bit more about like that connection and how it's strengthened, and maybe if there's anything that you've taken away from that experience in terms of being able to connect to your mind body neurosomatic circuit?
I suppose the first thing to know about it was that it was possible. So it was possible to access other mind states. But after I kind of came down from the high of the experience or whatever it was months later, I didn't still retain that kind of control over my emotions. But at least I knew it was possible to do those kinds of things. And of course, later I learned somewhat how to do that with meditation.
I mean, what you're describing almost sounds more like Circuit 7, like just being able to become self-aware and like unravel your previous patterns and become control over your emotions.
Well, it's probably related to circuits 5, 6, and 7.
I should say Circuit 7 is the metaprogrammer. It's a circuit that allows you to go back and reprogram your previous cognitive structures. And Circuit 6 is the neuro-genetic circuit. So it's about accessing the ancestral archetypes and stuff like that.
Yes. So in terms of Circuit 7, it was like I had this spontaneous experience, and that enabled me or forced me to let go of some previous preconceptions. But I didn't really have, as I said, I didn't have a framework. So it wasn't like I could consciously say, all right, I'm going to choose my beliefs accordingly or something like that. Well, I was in this state of reaction to whatever was going on inside my body and soul.
It seems like in terms of psychosis, I guess I can kind of see a connection to Circuit 7 and maybe to Circuit 5. It seems like part of what's happening with psychosis is it increases your ability to recognize patterns, much like psychedelics do. So you can potentially see more patterns in the world that are real, but it also causes you to overfit to patterns that aren't really there. Like you said, like with that person who thought there was a microphone in the seashell and stuff like that. And something I've seen in people I've met with psychosis, there also seems to be a pattern of people with psychosis often seem to latch on to a particular pattern or false pattern so hard that they don't even notice when they're abandoning logic and rationality to cling to that pattern.
Yes, I'd say so. And so, you know, in a sense, that's a kind of seventh circuit metaprogramming experience, but it's like just touching it. It's like you get a taste and you don't really know what's going on. And so it leads to this state of dysfunction.
Something else related to the fifth circuit, this is a little bit different. I wanted to talk a little bit about exercise because I really had no idea how powerful exercise is. And it's something that has a lot of scientific backing to it. But I felt like when I started exercising, the way that it impacted my mood and the way that it impacted my state of being overall was so great that I felt like I had just missed some kind of huge memo about the basics of how to be a functioning human being. And now it's really wonderful. Like I knew that exercise gives you endorphins, but for me, consistent exercise really changes my whole mood, mental state, internal sense of clarity, etc. Have you guys had similar experiences with that?
Yeah, my experience was similar to yours. Once I started exercising regularly, I noticed that my mood was consistently better. It was kind of like, like this missing puzzle piece. And it was like, my brain was like, like, obviously, come on. How did you not know that humans are supposed to exercise? Humans are supposed to move around and expend energy and run and jump and climb and do all these things. And Wilson talks about how endorphins are heavily tied into circuit 5 and how cannabis, psychedelics, meditation, pranayama, and the visualization of white light can trigger the release of endorphins, which then triggers circuit 5.
There are a lot of studies that suggest one of the best ways to deal with depression or to treat depression is to do exercise, and especially in nature. Not that it works in every case, but it's really that powerful.
Yeah, like have you guys tried climbing a tree recently?
No, I haven't done that for
it's like
more than 20 years.
It's so blissful whenever I do it. But like I'm 31 years old, so I have to like make sure that nobody sees me because then somebody would be like, what's that like random adult man doing in that tree?
El
Like,
gringo mono.
That's not where that guy's supposed to be.
I actually, the last time I climbed a tree was a few years, maybe 3 years ago or so. My friend's daughter, they lived out in the country, and there was this like massive tree outside the house. And like the kid was like 9, and she would like climb the tree, and like the parents would worry, but they would like kind of allow it to happen because it's like a growing up thing. And so I climbed the tree with her one day, and I was like terrified that that she would fall the day when I was climbing the tree with her, or that I would fall, the branches wouldn't be able to support my weight. And I was like freaking out, but the kid was like, come on, you got to get to the top. And so I did. And at the top, like I could like see the rooftop of the house down below and like the whole forest. And it was pretty cool. It was definitely like a circuit 5 training kind of thing.
Yeah, I think cool. This is characteristic of circuit 5. Like we have these fears and anxieties which are pulling us down, and probably being produced by some of these lower circuits, circuit 1, circuit 2, circuit 3, constantly telling us narratives about how terrible of a person we are, how we're not adequate or whatever. Circuit 4, making us feel guilty. And in order to access circuit 5, it's almost like we have to shut off all of those processes and just kind of give into the flow of existence. Turn off your mind, relax, and float downstream, as John Lennon says, quoting some guru, pretty sure.
I mean, one interesting thing Katie brought up is, I guess, to have a complete change of pace from like innocence to not innocence. But so circuit 5 is really associated with cannabis. Like Robert Anton Wilson talks about how smoking cannabis is a really effective way to access circuit 5. And it's also associated with MDMA. And I'm kind of curious, like, do you guys agree that both these substances are connected to circuit 5? Do you think they have a different relationship to circuit 5? How do you guys understand that connection?
I think it's really interesting how we talked about how climbing a tree can put you into a childlike state. And I think that circuit 5 is kind of like a childlike state. It's this kind of like trusting, like exploratory, playful mode. And so I think those substances and methods of accessing circuit 5 that you just mentioned do that. They kind of put you into this trusting, childlike state where you can then kind of heal. I think this is a lot of why cannabis is becoming so popular right now, is because our generation misses we feel like we missed our childhood, or we had our childhood and it was snatched away from us, because we had to go work, and now we're all stressed out.
I disagree that circuit 5 is about necessarily a trusting, childlike, playful state. For me, circuit 5 is about when I feel rooted in my body and I feel connected with how my physical sensations and my physical body impacts my mind and vice versa. And it's not necessarily childlike. I mean, it can also be very dark. It can also be very difficult. And I don't think it's always playful.
Well, was being a kid always playful, or was it sometimes dark?
Being a kid was sometimes dark. I guess I don't see the connection with childlikeness necessarily in circuit 5. A lot of times when I'm accessing circuit 5, I feel very, very much adult, very much like I'm tapping into something that's a form of knowledge that I would have known nothing about when I was a child. I had no connection with my body as a child whatsoever.
Yeah, I think circuit 5 is a mindful version of circuit 1.
Of the survival circuit, of the biosurvival circuit?
Yeah, like I think you can use circuit 5 in order to reprogram circuit 1 because it's like this evolved version of circuit 1. It can dampen your feelings of fear, or it can increase your feelings of fear just by thinking about it. When you're a kid, you experience all of those things, but you're not mindful of them. And then when you revisit those states as an adult, you're mindful of them because you're in circuit 5 rather than circuit 1.
This kind of gets to a point that I was wondering about. Katie, you said like you understand circuit 5 as producing greater understanding of how your body works and stuff like that.
Yes.
And I wonder to what extent circuit 5 is about conscious understanding, because I was thinking about it earlier today. And it seems like I was wondering, is circuit 5 about bringing things to consciousness and having an experience based on that? Or is it just about having an experience or having something alter in your subconscious so that a different experience shines forth through your emotions and your consciousness? Like, I'm not entirely sure it's a conscious process.
Yeah, that's a good point. Actually, especially when he lists like practices that get people in touch with circuit 5, like faith healing, religious experiences, flow type experiences, creative pursuits, I think that oftentimes it's very unconscious. And I think you can definitely tap into circuit 5 without having a deep conscious understanding of what's going on. That's probably my own personal experience seeping into it because I'm very analytical.
Yeah, well, I'd say you can have a peak experience and a circuit 5 bliss experience spontaneously. And when you understand it a little bit better, like when you had a couple of them, you start to realize, oh, there's certain things I can do to put me in the place where I'm more likely to have those experiences.
Yes, I think that the conscious understanding is beneficial, or at least having a conscious understanding of what connects you with those peak experiences, what connects you with your body is beneficial if you want to be able to master the use of circuit 5 and use it to improve your life.
Okay, but we're talking about a few different levels here, because there's a difference between like the conscious understanding of what's going to put you in circuit 5 and the conscious understanding of your own body that produces an experience. Like the thing that got me thinking about this is I was thinking about Vipassana, which is all about a form of meditation where you focus on feeling every part of your body. And after you do that for a while, you can like feel inside your body supposedly and feel your organs, and you have peak experiences around that. And the idea is that as you're feeling your body and you're observing your body, you start to observe your mind, your internal structures, yourself. And that leads to circuit 7 metaprogramming experiences. And just thinking about that, it occurs to me that like, I'm not entirely sure the difference between circuit 5 and circuit 7 is body versus mind. It seems more like maybe circuit 5 is about straightening things out subconsciously and having experiences based on that. And then that paves the way for circuit 7, which is about gaining conscious awareness either of your mind or of your body.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would say that circuit 5 is probably when people talk about mindfulness, they're probably mostly talking about circuit 5, because I think that's your introduction to mindfulness. Like you're sitting there being like, okay, what am I feeling? What parts of my body feel tension? And as you were saying, Ariel, eventually this leads you to be mindful of your thoughts and the structures that are forming your thoughts. And yeah, I guess as you said, it kind of paves the way for circuit 7, where you can reprogram your thoughts. But yeah, no, I don't remember where I was going with that. I guess I'm mostly just agreeing with you, Ariel.
I do see circuit 5 as being about the body and circuit 7 as being about the mind. Perhaps I'm just chunking up these concepts differently, but When I think of neuro-somatic, it's very much that mind-body connection. It's about psychosomatic systems. It's about how your anxiety affects your body or how your bliss affects your body, and like recognizing that we're not just a detached brain. Maybe it's not so much about the recognition, but the experience of that fullness and that groundedness in your physical being. And perhaps conscious understanding isn't a necessary part of Circuit 5, but I think that those experiences are what it's about, like specifically the experiences of your body. Whereas Circuit 7, I think, is about thinking about your thinking. It's about rationalism.
But yeah, I don't know, it's complicated. Like I almost could see it like tying into what Chris was saying about childhood, because it seems like in childhood you have a more present experience of your body, and then through the process of growing up and maybe like puberty, there's a kind of like fall, or an Edenic fall, where like you become like self-conscious, and so you start to like construct rationalizations around your body and around the way you are in the world, and that makes you like awkward, like you get stuck in Circuit 3, or it's easy for that to happen. And then Circuit 5 is almost like a remedy to that, because you get back to being in like a just experiencing state where you're just experiencing nature, you're just experiencing your body, or you're just in a kind of flow state. It seems like the next stage is where you're able to like the conscious mind re-enters the picture and is able to reflect on what's happening both in your mind and in your body, because at that point through Circuit 5 they've been like remarried.
Yeah, it's almost like the odd numbered circuits form this kind of layer cake where Circuit 1, you're just feeling your physical security basically, and Circuit 3 is you're just rationalizing. You're totally disconnected from your body and totally disconnected from like having a physical presence. And then Circuit 5 is like you're consciously trying to only think about your physical experience. And then Circuit 7 is you're consciously trying to only think about your rational thoughts. So being present and being rational are like kind of stacking up as you go up the circuits.
I do feel that Circuit 5 is about presence. I think Ariel's point was a good one. I was focused on like what I understand about my body from having experienced Circuit 5, but I think Circuit 5 is about that presence, not just consciously thinking about being present in your body, but actually having that full experience.
So does anyone feel like they've mastered the circuit? And if so, how do you feel like you've gone about it?
I don't know about mastered, but I got a pretty good angle on it. So this year, a few months ago, I rented a house in the country, and I stayed there for a month, and I meditated a lot, like about 90 hours within a month. And I tried to find out what happiness is all about. So there's one framework that I learned from my monk friend in Thailand, where he talks about using a particular meditation device. And he says, think about it like this. So say you have a meditation device, like listening to the sounds around you, or perhaps chanting a mantra, focusing on the sensations in your body. At a certain point, something is going to change within you. So it normally happens around 12 or 15 minutes into seated meditation. There is a shift in consciousness. And if you're aware and you're watching for it, it is marked. Almost as notable as, say, the point where you realize, oh, I'm getting drunk or something, or I'm getting high or something like that. There is a difference in consciousness. And so he said, think about this meditation device as a tugboat, and it's tugging your consciousness or your mind or whatever it is, which is this big ocean liner, tugging it out into the middle of the ocean. And when you get out into the middle of the ocean, you're in this great expanse of water and kind of nothingness. And that's when things start to get kind of interesting. It's a bit hard to describe, but there are certain things that can happen once you get to that point, like mystical experiences, like you might start to have visions or hear voices in your head or things like that, or have emotions arise. And yeah, I thought a lot about happiness and joy in those days. And one thing that came out of it was this simple formula, which is it's kind of basic if you think about it. What the idea is, if you want to be happy, the first step is to have a strong desire to be happy. The second step is to create the circumstances to have happiness. And the third step is to let go of the desire for happiness. And all of those things are quite simple on the surface, but to actually enact them takes a lot of effort and a bit of planning.
Can you repeat those 3 steps, Kurt?
The first step is to have a strong desire or motivation to be happy. The second step is to create the circumstances for happiness. And the third step is to let go of the desire for happiness.
How do you create the circumstances for happiness? Like just through meditation?
So, well, that's part of it. So it's like all of what we've been talking about is part of it. So when we talk about things like going out in nature, doing exercise, getting sun, breathing deeply, doing meditation, doing things that truly fulfill you. So creative things that are expressions of maybe this deeper part of yourself, things that get you into a flow state, things like improvisation, dancing, things which move you away from your stifling, like what Johnson talks about in improv. And yeah, there are a whole lot of things, and people have to explore this for themselves as well, because it's also a highly personal process. So it is a question. What are the circumstances which are going to make you happy?
I think another important part of it is providing for your security. I think a lot of people feel anxious and insecure, especially with sort of financial concerns and maybe even physical safety concerns. And I think that part of being happy is addressing those concerns, doing something about it, putting yourself into a situation where you're going to have a profound sense of safety and security. And then just making some space on your schedule, and knowing deep down, okay, I have a few hours or something like that where I don't need to worry about anything, and I can use that time to focus on feeling happy and relaxing and going deeper into myself.
Yes, that's a very good point. And that's also, I think that's part of the reason why traditions like in the Judeo-Christian tradition, we have this day of rest, because it's like you need some time just to feel free, not to have to work. And if you don't do anything, it's absolutely fine. And it's actually even good for you.
What do you guys think about this connection between happiness and Circuit 5? Like, do you feel like if one has truly mastered Circuit 5, that they would be happy or content in some way?
Yes. Yes, I'd say the sublimation of Circuit 5 is a state of more or less permanent bliss. And even when somebody is sad or has some other negative emotion, they can contextualize it emotionally so it's actually a positive experience.
I think that gets to the crux of it.
Yeah, I think what Wilson is getting at in Prometheus Rising with Circuit 5 is that somebody who has mastered Circuit 5 is skilled at making themselves feel good. He quotes Timothy Leary as saying, you can't do good unless you feel good, in reference to this circuit, which I think is true.
Yeah, I kind of am of two minds about it, because it does seem like people sometimes talk about reaching a state where you kind of learn how to be happy, like you become able to be happy. And that seems like it's associated with the higher circuits. And it seems like circuit 5 is a big part of that, because it seems like it's about learning to get into this bliss state. But I kind of question too, because I mean, I have heard people say stuff like, after ayahuasca, like I discovered the capacity to be happy, or after like the landmark course, or after these things which are actually pretty intense circuit 7 things. So I almost wonder, like I do see this strong connection between the circuit 5 and circuit 7. Like they seem to be almost in a feedback loop, where it seems like, I almost wonder, like if you have these like knots within yourself, it almost seems like circuit 5 prepares you for circuit 7, and circuit 7 feeds back and lets you experience circuit 5 more fully. As if you haven't fully worked out your past and like your psychological issues and stuff like that, and the story of your life, I'm not sure how. It seems like that might almost be a precondition to happiness.
So I think one of the ways that circuit 7 feeds back into circuit 5 is that circuit 5 can only take you so far into happiness. That is to say, the same things will only bring you fulfillment for so long before you start having diminishing returns on those strategies. And I think this is kind of an eternal thing. Like you'll always have to find new strategies to make yourself feel happy, because the old strategies won't make you feel as good as they used to. And I think that's where circuit 7 comes in. It kind of helps you zoom out and say, okay, well, I've been doing this thing that made me feel happy before, but now I'm kind of feeling less fulfilled. So why is that? And I think circuit 7 can help you step back and figure out what that is.
There's definitely truth to that. But a counterpoint is about what Johnson talks about with spontaneity. When you have something that's spontaneous, when you can express yourself spontaneously, that is something that, in a sense, it's purely new. So it's from the moment. So if you have practices that involve spontaneity, then it's less likely that they're going to have diminishing returns because of that eternal newness.
I still think it feeds into each other. Like,
yes.
Like it's like the idea that if you're burdened by the past, then you have less space in your consciousness for the newness and the spontaneity. So the amount that you can experience circuit 5 in that way is constrained. And so opening that up opens up more space to experience the bliss state like circuit 5. But at the same time, if you spend a lot of time in circuit 5, like, sitting in the forest, reflecting, being spontaneous, stuff like that, probably you will start to spontaneously like have insights about yourself and about your life. And like you will spontaneously start to have circuit 7 moments.
Yeah, I see that feedback loop that you're talking about. For some people too, myself included, I think that I needed to hit circuit 7 on some level before I allowed myself to experience circuit 5, because I had to evaluate my reality tunnel, quote unquote, or my point of view of the world, and recognize that I wasn't valuing my own well-being and physical health enough. Like my circuit 7 analysis helped me focus in on being able to engage with circuit 5 or even think about trying to access it.
I think there's a slight temptation, because Leary and Wilson have put numbers on these things. We think that they're in a sort of order, but all of these things are actually part of the system and they're all interconnected. But yes, I absolutely say, like, if you want to learn to be more happy, then that's what you're trying to do is like engage circuit 7, which is asking the question, how do I be happy, which is circuit 5? Or how do I experience bliss, presence, and things like that?
All right. So next up is circuit 6, the neuro-genetic circuit. This circuit appears to be associated with the collective unconscious archetypes, things that Carl Jung talked about extensively. These kind of images that seem to be built into people collectively, into humans. Images like the Great Mother and the what is it, Pan, this kind of satyr god, kind of a goat man, things like, yeah, like the divine feminine, the divine masculine, things like that. Wilson talks about how this circuit appears to be located in the right hemisphere, and that it communicates with the left hemisphere using things like synchronicities and deja vu and moments of where you feel like something significant is happening or something really, really unlikely is happening. Wilson claims that that's basically your circuit 6 in your right brain trying to tell you something. So yeah, so the ways that Wilson has listed for activating circuit 6 are higher doses of LSD, 200 to 500 micrograms, higher doses of peyote, higher doses of psilocybin mushrooms, yoga, meditation. I was thinking maybe it might be possible to activate this circuit by just thinking about images, reading mythology. Yeah, just meditating on the imagery in a piece of fiction, looking for synchronicities, something like that. What do you guys think? You think that you can kind of prime your circuit 6 by essentially using your circuit 3 and just focusing on it or thinking about it?
So Vervaeke, who we've been referencing quite a bit in this series, he talks about 2 different types of reading. One type of reading being what most of us are used to in our culture. We're reading to evaluate truth value and to learn something. We're gaining information. But then he also talked about another form of reading, which I'm forgetting the term that he used for it. Does anybody remember?
Lectio divina.
Yeah, okay. So Vervaeke also talks about lectio divina, which is basically where you're reading a text in order to really...
Lectio divina.
Okay. Lectio. Okay, lectio divina.
Lectio. Lectio.
Okay.
Divina.
We'll cut out my mispronunciations. Lectio divina, which is... It's a different form of reading where you're reading to really take in the meaning into yourself. Almost reading like...
To feel it, to feel the truth behind it. The divinity behind it.
Yeah, exactly. To feel the truth behind it, or not even necessarily thinking about it as true or false, but just kind of accepting what you're given and trying to really feel it and experience it and take it in and make it part of yourself. And I think that if you practiced Lectio Divina with mythology or with things like the Bible, religious texts, or archetypal texts, that would be a way to access this circuit.
That's really interesting. And I think I agree with you that kind of trying to feel the meaning of words rather than necessarily thinking about trying to analyze it rationally might be a way to access this circuit. I think maybe I think maybe one of the reasons why I'm strongly agreeing with you is because the way that knowledge was handed down before written history was through oral tradition. And the way that oral tradition was handed down was through these stories that were kind of songs and rhymes. And I think that style, so I think music, with lyrics can do the same thing that Lectio Divina can do. It can kind of put you into this more kind of receptive state where you're feeling the words as they hit your eardrum instead of necessarily just interpreting them literally. So it helps us remember them better, and it kind of impacts our consciousness a lot greater and with a lot greater force, and probably causes us to make these connections maybe activate circuit 6.
Yeah, I mean, I would kind of take issue with the idea that we're rejecting rationality by reading in this way, because it seems to me that we're more letting go of being critical. But I mean, rationality is still necessary. Like, it's only human beings, obviously, that can read in this way. It seems to me that it's more like Vervaeke, I'm not sure if it's come up in the course yet, but he talks about how there's different kinds of rationality, and how there's this like open-minded kind of rationality where you're not evaluating what you're reading or hearing in terms of like, is it true? Is it not true? Do I agree? Do I not agree? But you're just allowing your mind to wrap around it, like to fully understand and experience it. And there still absolutely is a rational process. Like, your mind wrapping around ideas is what rationality is, but it's not critical.
when you read stuff that happens on the internet, a lot of times you're trying to figure out whether you should believe it. You know, you're trying to figure out whether you agree with it. And I think with Lectio Divina, you dispense with that process. You basically assume that what you're reading is true in some way. It might be in this very complex or kind of out there way, but you have to kind of really, really focus your mind on how it could be true in order to discover that. So, you know, if something that you read is just false and you put yourself into that state, then you might end up convincing yourself of something that's wrong.
I think this relates a lot to the theater. So, like, if you're going to do a play reading or you're going to act a role, it is very similar to this Lectio Divina. You're going to step inside the role, or you're going to read something as the character, and you're going to read the truth of it and feel the truth of it if you're really committed to it. And that could be a way to access archetypes as well. Like if you're acting out one of the fairies or the satyrs in Midsummer Night's Dream, something like that, you're getting in contact with Pan or similar.
Yeah, I think you made a good distinction, Ariel, between rationality and critique. It depends on how you define rationality, but it definitely, Lectio Divina does engage the mind, like you said. I agree with Kurt. It's kind of about getting into the role, or I see it as trying to connect with the text as opposed to trying to pick something out of the text or get something out of the text. That's the way the distinction is for me. Like, for example, when I was a teenager, I did try to read the Bible and some holy texts, but I was analyzing them for truth value from, you know, an angry teenage atheist perspective, thinking like, this sounds like bullshit. This doesn't make any sense. They're not logically backing up why they're saying that this is true. But that's very different from how I would engage with something now, where if I want to engage with a religious text, I'm not necessarily thinking about, is it true? Do I believe it? I'm trying to feel the feelings and engage with the stories that have moved countless people throughout many cultures, throughout thousands of years.
I was just thinking about the same example, actually, because when I was a teenager, I did the same thing. Like, I read most of the Bible, and I was definitely analyzing it from a Circuit 3 and Circuit 4 perspective. Like, this is so ridiculous. This is so terrible. How can people like this? Like reading it to criticize and condemn, basically. And then when I was older, like when I was in my early 20s, a friend of mine was a Christian political radical and kind of explained to me how a lot of the Bible can be viewed as political allegory. And so I revisited it from that perspective, and that kind of allowed me to see a lot of the larger themes in it and a lot of like the socio-cultural, the ways that it's still relevant to today. And I gained a new appreciation of it through that. And then more recently, I've been getting into, the past couple of years, I've gotten into Jordan Peterson and like watching his like biblical lecture series in the book of Genesis and stuff like that, and listen to him talk about the Bible. That adds a whole other layer, because now I'm like kind of understanding how it fits into this like Jungian archetypal framework. And I think in both of those like latter ways of reading the Bible, it does get into some like archetypal Circuit 6 understandings.
Jordan Peterson is an interesting person to talk about in terms of a thinker that I think is helping a lot of people in our culture connect with Circuit 6 in a way that maybe we haven't before. I don't have a lot of experience with Jordan Peterson, but I know maybe you do more. Do you feel like Jordan Peterson is kind of a catalyst for getting a lot of people in touch with Circuit 6, or do you see him as a different kind of figure?
Oh, absolutely. I definitely think he is. I think you can trace a historical trajectory from Carl Jung to Jordan Peterson. Like, it's interesting because Carl Jung kind of was the figure that brought Circuit 6 into consciousness in a way. Because Carl Jung, he's this psychologist who developed this framework for understanding all religions, like this meta framework where he's looking at the pattern that connects human culture and religion. So he talks about like he's the one that came up with this concept of archetypes and the great mother archetype and the trickster archetype and all these things. And he was a brilliant thinker and wrote all these books, but they're a little complex, and not everyone read those books, and they still haven't completely, the intellectual world and academia still hasn't completely caught up with Carl Jung. But you have this like other historical trajectory coming from Carl Jung, which is through the work of what is that guy? Joseph Campbell. Through the work of Joseph Campbell, who's viewed as a great popularizer of Carl Jung, because he wrote like A Hero with 1,000 Faces and stuff like that, where he describes the archetype of the hero's journey, and he was a much more like fun, engaging writer. And his work has greatly influenced Hollywood and popular culture. Like Star Wars was directly based on Hero with 1,000 Faces. Like George Lucas just like took the hero's journey as described by Joseph Campbell and created a space opera around it without changing too much, like just point for point. And it became this like massive blockbuster hit. And now like since then, the ways that these movies are written they're very based around the hero's journey. This concept of the hero's journey is it's permeated culture very much the level of fiction. And so in that way, like I think that's the way that a lot of people access Circuit 6 is by watching Star Wars or watching the Marvel movies and watching these modern mythological sagas, which are still tapping into those archetypes in some ways consciously through that lineage of like George Lucas, Joseph Campbell, Carl Jung. And then you get the second lineage now, which is happening, where I would say Jordan Peterson is, in a way, he's like bringing Circuit 6 to the conscious mind, because like Joseph Campbell and George Lucas kind of brought it to the unconscious mind in a way, or they made it more articulated through the unconscious of fiction. And now Jordan Peterson is basically like just explaining Carl Jung to people, or explaining his interpretation of Carl Jung. And people are actually thinking about it consciously to probably an extent that hasn't happened in mass culture before.
Yeah, that's very interesting that you point out that Carl Jung kind of pointed it out in a way where popular culture hasn't really caught up with it yet, but Joseph Campbell and now Jordan Peterson are kind of allowing or helping popular culture to catch up with Carl Jung. And I think that maybe you guys talked about this while I was gone, but the thing that Circuit 6 does is it takes your present experience and it connects that with something deep in humanity's past. And so something like the hero's journey is, something that Jordan Peterson would say, this is something that came out of, at least, as far back as written history goes, basically. I think the Sumerians had the story of, Marduk and Tiamat, and where Marduk was the hero. And the Egyptians had the story of Horus, who was kind of this son figure, where the father figure was Osiris, and the son figure was Horus. And Osiris dies, and Horus has to go on this quest to save his father, and gives him his eye, and brings back this piece of knowledge. It has to basically strike out into the unknown, gains this new knowledge, and then resurrects his father in some sense. So it does seem like that hero's journey archetype is deeply embedded in our cultural and maybe even at this point our genetic history. And Wilson would say that our Circuit 6 is helping us tap into that.
Yeah, and the story of Horus is the same story as Hamlet, and it's the same story as The Lion King. So there's an argument to be made that when people watch The Lion King, they're accessing Circuit 6. And then when they listen to Jordan Peterson analyzing The Lion King in terms of Carl Jung, I don't know what that is. Maybe it's some combination of Circuit 6 and 7. I don't know.
So like watching things like The Lion King or Star Wars might be kind of unconsciously making us access Circuit 6. But do you think that just watching these cultural movies that hit on these archetypes fulfills our need for Circuit 6 or helps us actualize in this way? Or what more would you guys say that we need or that we should do in order to really get there?
Are you saying in order to master Circuit 6? Or
Yeah,
or to access it? Or
Well, okay. So I'm thinking that like, perhaps if there are these archetypes like the hero's journey or like the great mother that are embedded in our cultural history, or maybe even in our DNA or in our unconscious psyche somehow, there's part of us that craves connecting with those kinds of stories and those kinds of figures. And I guess I'm wondering if having stories and films that connect with those kinds of storylines is enough, or what else can one do to really get there? Like, do you think that those movies are true access to circuit 6, or are they almost like something that's filling a void that we're trying to connect to?
I think it's like these things are programming our circuit 6, or they're informing our circuit 6, but it's not. It's maybe there's even this distinction between somebody programming your circuit, accessing a circuit, and mastering a circuit. Like there's some outside force imposing.
Well, and I think that there must be some element of creative expression too that happens when you've mastered this circuit. So the person who created The Lion King, for instance, who produced it and, designed it so that it would impact the human psyche in as big a way as possible. That person seems to have mastered circuit 6. And they're putting this new version of the archetype out there into the collective consciousness. And so I think when you've mastered this circuit, you probably do something similar. You probably create things that activate circuit 6 in other people. And so what you're doing is you're drawing on the past, but you're also sort of adding to it.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And it gets into this idea of like, I'm not entirely sure the truest expression of circuit 6 is necessarily the most consciously rational. Like, it seems to me like the people who created The Lion King weren't like, okay, so what are the archetypes? Let's read some Carl Jung. Clearly we want the great father here, and then he's going to come back. It's another symbol of the great father combined with the archetype of the, they weren't doing that. They were probably had read Hamlet, and they were like creating a lion version of it and just drawing on their own who they were and how the emotions and stuff like that. Like, it's a semi-conscious process. Like, it's part of it's happening in consciousness and part of it's happening in subconsciousness.
Exactly. I think basically all Disney movies are examples of this, where the creators have read some classic story, Snow White, Cinderella, and they've adapted it and animated it for general audiences in under 2 hours.
So it's interesting. I wonder if maybe it's more conscious than we might think. I don't have any evidence for this, but thinking about things like pop music, I know that pop music producers have very much a formula, which you could kind of consider like an archetype. There's certain styles of music that are familiar to us, and the whole verse, chorus, bridge, chorus thing is, it helps guide us along the story. It's like a grammar that everyone understands. And musicians are extremely conscious of that, specifically pop musicians. Like I had an acquaintance who worked on the production team for Britney Spears' music back in the early 2000s. And he would talk about how they did that extremely purposely. They studied like the mind and how to create hooks and really understood this context. And when it comes to things like stories and films, the hooks are so omnipresent. I wouldn't be surprised if it was on a pretty conscious level.
This is where Jordan Peterson would make a distinction between propaganda and art. And this is also in Robert Anton Wilson's terms, you make the same point. This is where circuit 3 and circuit 4 can devour circuit 6. So you get situations where if I'm like, I really think society should accept gay people more, I'm going to make a piece of fiction that has that message, the central message, like people should accept gay people more. And I'm going to have these 2 gay people, and they're going to be oppressed by the evil religious people, and then this and this and this is going to happen. Maybe they'll be lions. Like that's me, my circuit 4 self, basically like let's say I want to bring, if I want to bring some archetypes into it, I can bring, let's say I want to bring in the great mother, but not really the great father, because it doesn't work so well here, but I'll bring in the great mother. So there'll be a mother nature. Like I can bring in circuit 6 elements, but circuit 4 is the one that's in charge and running the show. And so basically circuit 4 is like exploiting circuit 6 to produce this piece of propaganda that I'll call art and sell as art, versus a more true expression of circuit 6 would be actually to be like living within the archetypes and to kind of let go of what circuit 4 is saying is right or circuit 3 is saying is true, and just to allow the archetypes to play and to unfold in a more organic way, where I am in touch with the subconscious and where I am in touch with DNA memory and these things that are greater than my own preference as an individual.
Remember, I went to see the film Interstellar with my friend Mariana, and she cried like all the way through that film. But then afterwards, I asked her, "Did you like it?" And she was like, "No, I didn't really like it." And I was like, "That is so strange. How can you connect so much emotionally with something, but at the same time not really like it?" And she was like, "Yeah, it was kind of too much Yankee, Yankee, Yankee propaganda stuff." So it was like the filmmakers had designed this film to hit emotional buttons, but there wasn't the true depth to it.
Interesting. And when you hit those emotional buttons in conjunction with the story and with the message, for a lot of people, that's going to work and perhaps change their mind or inspire them into something.
Well, and this is what I was thinking the whole time, is like, maybe a lot of these archetypes started that way, you know. Maybe there was some king who was like, oh, you know, we should have an archetype of, you know, X, Y, and Z. And so he, you know, produced some propaganda and which is basically marketing, and just reprogrammed everybody to think a certain way. And lo and behold, it actually ended up being somewhat sustainable. And now it's kind of embedded in us. You know, it's possible that that's how these archetypes start.
Yes.
If you truly believe in circuit 6, then I think the line of reasoning would go that propaganda can have a big effect, but it has no longevity. Whereas something that really taps into the archetypal roots of humanity, only something that's truly archetypal can be cross-cultural. So the Bible, even though there's elements of it that certainly are propaganda, it taps into something so fundamental that it still resonates with people who are completely disconnected from the ancient Israelite culture. The same thing for the Epic of Gilgamesh, the same thing for these things that survive, even books that are a few hundred years old, like Pride and Prejudice. Surely there were other romances written at the time that surely made some money, but the ones that we still read today have something to them that's deeper than the propaganda.
It makes me wonder about god kings like Deva Rajas. Like, so for example, Rama the Ninth in Thailand, still hailed as king, still hailed as a god, and it's very much this great father archetype. But if the kingdom of Thailand falls, people probably won't remember his majesty too much anymore.
I was going to say, I do wonder how much of what survives because it's truly resonant, and how much of it survives because the propaganda is so great, or it picks up on a trend so great that it becomes part of the culture and then lives on. Like, for example, the Bible. Okay, I'm not saying that I can't connect with the Bible, or that I don't think that the Bible has something special to it. But if a Roman emperor hadn't become a Christian, I don't think that we would be pointing to the Bible today. Like, I think that a lot of what makes the Bible resonate so much is that it has seeped its way into our culture so much that it becomes resonant to people, like in a feedback loop through its own influence.
Yeah, I mean, you definitely have a point there that, you know, maybe just the fact that we connect with it has to do more with the fact that it's just so ubiquitous, and has less to do with the fact that it's true. But I would push back on that a little bit, and I would ask, well, why has it lasted so long if there was nothing true in it?
I'm not saying that there's nothing true in it. I just don't know that it's more true than perhaps other religious texts that were there at the time that have been lost. I really don't know. And as to why it's lasted so long and spread so far, I think that's a really interesting question about memes and how ideas and movements spread. I don't know. Part of it is about influence and empire. Like, why is English one of the most widely spoken languages in the world? Is there something true about English in comparison to Spanish? Well, I guess Spanish is also widely spoken. Is there something true about Spanish in comparison to Portuguese? I don't think so.
Well, I mean, I think for one thing, we have to be careful about the term true, because in this case, we're talking about circa 6 truth, which is archetypal truth. So that's getting at something that's
right,
cross-cultural.
To be fair, that is what I meant. I meant archetypal truth. Like, is there something archetypally true about Spanish that is not true about Portuguese?
I understand that's what you and Chris meant. I just wanted to clarify for whoever's watching. But I think this gets back to the question of whether you think everything is random or whether you think everything matters or everything happens purposefully in some way. Like, you can think that Christianity became the official religion of the Roman emperor it was just in the right place at the right time, or you can think that there was something about the Christian doctrine that resonated so deeply with so many people that Constantine had no choice but to make it the empire of the religion, or maybe he was truly converted. Like, there's different ways you can look at it.
Well, and I think you hit the nail on the head, Katie, when you talked about memes. I think that memes are absolutely an expression of Circuit 6. And as Wilson talks about, as Dawkins talks about, I guess, memes go through this process of natural selection, which is similar to the process that happens with genes, which is a stochastic process. And that is, there's an element of randomness where random things are being generated, people are making memes and stuff, and certain of those memes get selected. And they change, they evolve, they change, and they kind of formulate themselves into the version that's most significant to the greatest amount of people. And then they just kind of stick around. And I would say that those memes, or those archetypes, or whatever you want to call them, that end up kind of dominating for long periods of time, have something sort of more deeply true than the rest of the memes.
This might be a good time to get into hardware versus software type of Circuit 6. Like, you had made an interesting distinction when we talked about this before, that maybe there are certain grammars or archetypes that are embedded in us through culture and through history, and others that might be more in us genetically.
Can I make a point about language before we move on?
Yeah.
So my friend Bob likes to say that English is a very mechanical language. It's like an industrial era language. It's like this bit goes into this bit. It's like a language of tools. And so it might actually be the reason that English fits in a modern age is because the world is still getting through this post-industrial stage. Whereas like the other day, my friend Bob also studies Sanskrit as his part of his yoga practice, and reading the Yoga Sutras the other day, it's quite amazing the kind of words they have. And they said in the ancient days, people used to sing the language. So it's something very, very qualitatively different about the language. This is a language of sages, and it's a single word can have this powerful spiritual meaning. So I think that in that sense, English is the true language, because it's the true language of the age, of the industrial and post-industrial age.
And I'd like to add that English is absolutely the wrong language that you want to sing in. If you're studying opera, you'll know that you have to learn Italian and French and German and things like that. But English will not serve you very well.
English is not particularly beautiful or particularly poetic or particularly specific, or
I don't know. I would defend English here. I think English is actually a really cool language. It's one of the only languages. It comes from two completely separate language groups that are kind of combined. So you have a much more variety of expression in English than in most languages, because there's like a Latin-based word and like I forget what the term is, language group, but like the Anglo-Saxon-based, Germanic-based word. And it's got more words than any other language, also because of borrowing words at this point.
Yeah, English is the JavaScript of spoken languages. It basically is popular because it's compatible with everything, but it's actually kind of ugly.
It's very useful. I don't mean to insult it so much. Like it's extremely functional, and you can express a lot with it, and it's relatively simple grammatically compared to a lot of languages. The pronunciation is wacky, but it's just not, it's not quite so pretty. I think you hit on something interesting when you said it's a combination. It is kind of like a combination. It's like a melting pot language, and you can tell it's a language where like we pulled the best of both worlds to make it more useful and functional and simple and easy, relatively easy to learn and stuff like that. But in doing so, it's different from other languages like Spanish or French, where the language and the words within them feels very connected to the culture and kind of a state of being and a mindset that's.
Well, yeah, and the rules, like the rules of Romance languages seem elegant and consistent, whereas English has all these exceptions and stuff that, you know, again, they make English really, really compatible, like really exaptable. You know, if you look at India, you know, the version of English spoken there is very different from the English that we're used to, but it's still basically, like English.
Yeah, and I mean, maybe all this kind of answers Katie's point earlier in a kind of roundabout way, because everything we're saying about English is how it's exaptable, exportable, very functional. You can do a lot of things with it. It brings in the best from different worlds, but sacrifices some beauty. It sacrifices some connectedness to its own origins and culture. Maybe all those things you could say about the British Empire as well. And maybe that gives a bit of an explanation for why English is a global language.
Totally. It totally feels like all of the attributes of English that we're describing are very similar to the British Empire and also to the US. Yeah. One more interesting example of language that I was just thinking is Arabic. How Arabic is very neatly designed and grammatically precise, and everything has a root word that you can manipulate in these certain ways. And also God, Allah, is imbued into the language in nearly every, I don't even want to say colloquialism, because they're so universal. Like if you want to say hopefully, you say God willing, and things along those lines. Like so many expressions have God imbued in it, to the point where I've heard Muslims say things like, of course the Quran was written in Arabic because it's the perfect language. It's the language of God. And it's interesting how they see those things as connected.
Yeah, like another interesting thing with language historically is like, yeah, I agree with what you're saying. Arabic is like an especially beautiful language in a lot of ways. Like an interesting thing is like, I've heard an argument that Latin is part of the reason why the West developed the scientific method. Because in Latin, they have so many conjugations. Like they literally have like a conjugation for every tense you could possibly imagine, and then like 15 more that you've never even imagined. Like something like,
yeah,
it will have happened before the time that this other thing had happened, but after the present. You know, like it just, they have really such complicated tenses, and it's like just such like an insane mental burden to learn them all. But meanwhile, like just having like training that ability to like categorize and to like make these distinctions and to like place everything in time in this really precise way, like it somehow trained the Western mind to think scientifically. Whereas like you look at China, where the language, it doesn't really have tenses. Like the tenses are contextual. Like you put different words together and you kind of infer what the tense is. And China, like, and the words like can mean different things in different places. Like it's much more inferential and symbolic. And that makes it like so that China has really good poetry, but it also made it so that like, because it's a strange thing historically, like China was so technologically advanced compared to the West in the Middle Ages. Like they were like light years ahead, but they didn't develop the scientific method, and the West did. And some people say it was Latin.
So this conversation seems to be getting away a little bit from Circuit 6. Do we have any final thoughts on Circuit 6 before we move to Circuit 7?
Yeah. Oh, so one other thing, getting back to Circuit 6, it's a funny connection with language that we often refer to these archetype structures as grammars. But I wanted to ask a little bit about the distinction between hardware versus software grammars, like grammars that we feel are really in us, in our core, hardware-wise, versus grammars that are there more culturally. Do you see a distinction there, or do you think it kind of flows together, or they feed into each other?
Yeah, so in my opinion, the difference between hardware and software in humans is similar to the difference between hardware and software in computers. And that is, when something is in hardware, it's more instinctual. It's much, much faster, but it's much harder to change. And so you don't want to program something into hardware until you're sure that you're going to need it for a long time. And so what you want to do is you want to have everything in software until it's been tested and proven in the real world. And then once you know that it works and you know that it's going to continue to work for a long time, then you can go ahead and make the hardware version. And that makes it, again, much faster, much more instinctual, much more base. Like you don't have to think about it. You just do it. And so, yeah, I would say that the things that are in hardware are somehow more true. They've been proven in practice for a long time. And so our bodies understand this and program them into the structures of our brain and maybe even down into our DNA. And software is good for experimentation. Software is good for, okay, well, we don't know what works, so let's just try a bunch of different things. And then you can quickly iterate. You can quickly find which things don't work. You can find which things kind of work and, tweak them so that they're perfect. And then once they're perfect, then you can make the hardware version.
Do you want to give an example of a hardware archetype or something that you think is hardware?
Oh boy. I would say that circuit 1 is probably the most hardware of any of the circuits. And so that's something that...
All right, I'm asking about circuit 6.
Hold on.
Okay.
I'm gonna get there.
Okay.
So circuit 6 tells us about circuit 1. Circuit 1 imprints the mother, or is related to our experiences with the mother figure. And so I would say that all of the feminine and mother archetypes have to do with circuit 1, and all of the father archetypes have to do with circuit 2. And I think those circuits are older than humanity, much, much older than humanity. And so I would posit that those archetypes have been around, maybe not in circuit 6, but they've been in our genes for a long time. And I think Wilson basically is saying, we can use circuit 6 to look into what our genes are telling us. So of course, all forms of life, or most forms of life, have these lower circuits, but they probably don't. Well, they definitely don't have a circuit 6 where they can just think about it, and it just kind of comes to them, in their minds, because they don't have minds. But they are experiencing it, and I think that circuit 6 is telling us something about that deeper hardware experience.
I mean, yeah, this is kind of one of the great debates of our time, right? Like if a post-structuralist was here for this conversation, they'd be screaming, because there's like that whole movement of thought right now that's extremely popular that basically says that a lot of the things that we assume are inborn or hardware are actually cultural software that have been passed down for a long time and that are just so ingrained in our software that we're not aware of them. You can get people like Judith Butler arguing that even our ideas of biological sex are cultural, like that, making the distinction in that way. And that's, it's I think it's easy to scoff at those kinds of ideas when you're not actually like from a distance, but they make some interesting points. And it kind of gets back to what Katie was talking about before about like, why did Christianity become the religion of the Roman Empire? Why do we speak English? All this. And I think it's a big part of the question of what is software and what is hardware. So it's just centered around this question of like, I think the thing about like hardware and software is it allows for, I think the thing about this hardware software distinction is it produces pretty different visions of how human history works and how the world works. I think Jordan Peterson is putting forward a version of the world where human history is very much being influenced by our biology, and that the way that we're responding to things, the ways that people respond to things, even on a micro level, creates these macro historical trends where the Bible is speaking to something deep within us. And so that is why it became popular. Or like something Socrates did just resonated on such a profound level with the human experience that it echoes through history thousands of years later. And that's one way of looking at history, is that it's this movement of these deep biological forces within us, these archetypes moving around and culture kind of flowing around it, versus the more post-structuralist way of looking at things where biology plays a relatively more minor role and culture carries so much momentum that a cultural construct in one civilization, like a piece of random propaganda, can gain steam and leapfrog to the next civilization where that's just something that happens. And it's just these kind of arbitrary cultural structures bumping into each other and accelerating or decelerating and all these things. So I think it's really hard to know.
Yeah, I think like anything, like any sort of two-sided debate, I think probably both sides of the debate have a point. As always, I think there's a spectrum of hardware to software, and you can see this in computer systems as well. Some things are more deeply ingrained, some things are kind of medium level ingrained, some things are very shallow. I think the thing that maybe the post-structuralists are trying to say is similar to what the people who talk about popular apps talk, like Facebook. Like, why is Facebook so dominant? And some people would say, well, it was totally random chance. And other people would say, well, it was doing something useful. And I think the truth lies somewhere in the middle. It happened along at a convenient time, and it also solved a problem that wasn't being solved before. So yeah, I think something similar can happen with our cultural software. Is Western civilization true? Probably not. Is it good? Does it work? I would say yes.
Okay. So next up is Circuit 7, which is the metaprogrammer. We referenced this a lot when we were talking about Circuit 5, which I think is fair. Circuit 7, the metaprogrammer, is basically the circuit, or my understanding of it is where you think about your thinking, think about your emotional reactions, take stock of your imprintings, of all your influences that are shaping the way that you filter information through the world and behave in your reality tunnel that you've constructed. You take a meta view, and then as you start to master it, you begin to be able to reshape, reprogram, try out different points of view, try out different reality tunnels, try out different personalities, and construct a way of being that's in line with what you want. Or at least anyway, that's what I see as the goal. So accessing and mastering this circuit is an interesting task because it requires you to kind of come outside of yourself and everything that you believe and be able to think about your beliefs. One thing that I looked into when I was researching this circuit and different ways of looking into it is I found an excellent Timothy Leary video called How to Operate Your Brain, which basically is a 30-minute long psychedelic trip that's listing out strategies for how to access and get you into the circuit, while like also ideally putting you in kind of a psychedelic and open state, which is the state that you want to be in to be able to tap into that meta view. So that's an interesting point. I highly recommend that. But out of that video, and also out of Robert Anton Wilson, and out of some of my own thinking and experience, it came up with a couple different ways and exercises that you can do to try to get into this and master this. And I figured we could kind of go through them and talk about our own experiences with these strategies. So for number one, and this is something that Robert Anton Wilson suggested, he suggested reading articles of opposing viewpoints. And I would expand on that, and not to just say reading articles of opposing viewpoints, but try to rabbit hole yourself into opposing viewpoints. Like, watch their content, read their articles, read their media, be on their forums, and see how that might shift your mindset. Have you guys ever done anything like this?
Sorry, when you say rabbit hole, you mean like from their perspective, what kind of box do I fit in? Is that what you mean?
By rabbit hole, what I mean is, like, I think it's one thing to every once in a while read an opposing viewpoint article. I think it's another thing to immerse yourself in like a media input stream of an opposing viewpoint. Like, if you are a very left-wing person, then perhaps subscribing to a bunch of right-wing newsletters, following a bunch of right-wingers on Twitter, watching right-wing YouTube videos every day, and seeing if it changes you.
I don't know if I've ever done that, like, so deep that I could call it rabbit holing. But I did things, while I was an ANCAP. I read things like the Communist Manifesto. But it was, for years, I knew that I should do that. I knew that I should look at the opposing viewpoints, but I did not. And I knew I was kind of limiting on some level, I knew that I was limiting my intellectual growth by not exposing myself to the opposite side.
But were you reading it critically, Kurt? Or were you reading it with like Lectio Divina?
Well, I wasn't reading it out loud, so not literally. But I was reading it to try to understand it. I wasn't reading it just to try to take it apart and say, this guy's an idiot or something like that.
Did it change your viewpoint at all once you finally did it?
I don't think so. I mean, obviously the Communist Manifesto isn't the most intellectually rigorous presentation of communism. Yeah. But I kind of liked it. I mean, I like what he talks about in terms of alienation. Like, I think that's a real thing. So part of the diagnosis that he's doing is accurate. So that was kind of cool. And I think it probably helps me relate a bit to Marxists.
Yeah, I guess what you're suggesting, Katie, is that you recognize that you have a reality tunnel and that there are probably other people for, things like right wing and left wing. It's almost like half the world is left wing and half the world is right wing. And so, if you're really embedded in one of those reality tunnels, you're basically saying, like, half the world is just wrong. And it's kind of weird and arrogant to do that. And so I think maybe that's one of the things that helps access Circuit 7 is just kind of be humble, like realize that you don't know everything, and that if a whole lot of people are saying something, then maybe there's an element of truth in it. And I definitely think that immersing yourself in their reality tunnel is a good way to do that. It's a good way to kind of expand your reality tunnel. Mm-hmm. I think people are really afraid of doing this because they identify with their reality tunnels, and they identify with the group of people that identifies with that reality tunnel. And so they have this kind of Circuit 1, fear that if they start using the lingo from the other side, that their tribe is going to reject them or something like that. But yeah, I think you have to kind of, as Leary says in that video that you referenced, you've got to take responsibility for your own thoughts, and you've got to take responsibility for operating your own brain. And I think that you can get a lot more freedom by formulating your own beliefs about things instead of just following the crowd, which is what most people do.
Yeah, to answer your question, Katie, I did do that at a certain point. I used to be very left-wing, and at a certain point I allowed myself to read material from reality tunnels that I found pretty abhorrent at the time. And actually, the first time I read this book, I did some of the exercises in those chapters. Like I started listening to right-wing news and stuff like that. And it did change my perspective a lot. And I actually changed the way I see things quite a bit, changed the way I live my life quite a bit.
One thing that I found kind of interesting through my own practice with this is maybe it's just me, but I have this sense that if I expose myself to a lot of media and a lot of input coming from a certain perspective, I'll be more likely to start believing in parts of that perspective over time, even if it's not something that I resonated with initially. Because I think that there's something about hearing something over and over again that primes your brain to accepting it, kind of like advertising or anything else. And I think one thing that's really good about this practice is about, reading opposing viewpoints and, sometimes even immersing yourself in opposing viewpoints, is it can help you not only understand the opposing viewpoint, but then also understand how you are influenced by the little lanes that you put yourself in.
Yeah, like I really resonate with that. Like it also shows you how like the structure of how all these different viewpoints are connected underneath the surface, like philosophically and historically and stuff like that. Like one thing, like after going through all that, like changing my viewpoint a bunch of times and like starting to learn about these meta structures, like when I went to Anarchapulco this winter, I was like, oh no, am I going to become an ANCAP at the end after hanging out with the ANCAPs for 3 weeks? And I totally didn't, because I feel like I had like a perspective on it, and like I kept bringing up these counter arguments. I don't feel like anyone addressed them adequately. So at the end, I was like, I'm not convinced by this ideology, even though I was like highly exposed to it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's not a guarantee that things are going to take, but I mean, we know that most people who are raised in a certain religion end up believing that religion. Most people who are raised by, most people tend to align with the political beliefs of their parents and things along those lines. Oh, I was going to say, I've also specifically, I've observed people in my past who like start really like getting into one line of content, specifically political content. And at first, maybe they're just watching it out of curiosity because they want to understand. But like the more that I see people watch things, the more that I see them incorporate that language. And I've observed that in myself enough now that I feel like I can combat it a little bit better or take an outside view.
Well, that's kind of the point of Circuit 7, right? Is it like it puts you above it all, so you can choose to enter into different perspectives, but you also aren't just like slave to like the flow of ideas that you're exposed to.
Yes.
So Ariel, so at Anarchapulco, you said, well, you talked to all these people about anarcho-capitalism, and it didn't change your mind. But I bet you changed your mind a little bit. I bet you talked to some people who presented some ideas that made you think that you hadn't considered before. And I bet it expanded your reality tunnel, even though you didn't like sign on to the ideology.
It definitely expanded my reality tunnel, and it was really interesting, and it got me thinking about a lot of different things. But it was like, I think there's a difference though between that, which is like probably more of, I think it's a combination of Circuit 3 and Circuit 7. But I, like a lot of the stuff I came up with was like sideways to what was going on, or it was like looking down at it from above and being like, this is a really interesting way of being in the world, and like shows interesting things about this thing, versus like just entering into the reality tunnel, which is like, if I had been like a naive Circuit 3 person, and maybe I'd like still believe my parents' ideology, or I'd grown up as a good Catholic and never been exposed to anything else, and I just go to Anarchapulco, it might have been a different experience where I was like, whoa, I never thought about any of this before, this is all so true. It's different.
Well, and I think the danger that Katie kind of suggested happens where you can start getting curious about this thing that opposes your original viewpoint, and then you get further and further into it because there's no pushback, right? You're just reading more and more and getting more and more rabbit holes into this thing. I think the danger comes from when you you don't have you're just hearing arguments that you've never heard before. And so you don't have a good way of necessarily pushing back against them. The other big danger, I think, is that espousing certain ideologies puts you into the social hierarchy of the people that espouse that ideology. And so espousing a certain ideology can give you power. And I think when you don't realize that, okay, I'm benefiting from basically adhering to this religion, then you can kind of run off the rails and you can kind of get into very irrational places that you wouldn't have gotten otherwise. And so I think if you can keep that in mind while you're reading opposing viewpoints, then you can have, just be cognizant of it and don't let yourself be sucked into it. Then I think you can have a very positive experience, and you can expand your reality tunnel. And that's what I like to do. I just like to seek out opposing viewpoints so that I can expand my reality tunnel.
Yeah. One thing about this too, like that I like to keep in mind when I'm reading things based on proponents of an ideology versus people who are criticizing a particular ideology, is that oftentimes the main proponents of any particular ideology are experts in that ideology. And so they know all of the arguments against that ideology, or all of the ones that people generally bring up. And they have specifically formulated, really well thought out, rational rebuttals to anything that people could bring up against their ideology. So when you're reading criticisms of an ideology, oftentimes it's not going to be as strong as the defense of the ideology, but just because the arguments for the ideology might be stronger doesn't mean that it's necessarily true. It just means that you have experts who have dedicated a lot of mental energy because they're much more invested than somebody who's criticizing the ideology in favor of their own ideology, unless maybe it's like an ex-member of that ideology or someone who has like a particular beef.
Right. I mean, if you look at, for instance, like Ron Paul or Larkin Rose or something like that in the liberty community, these people are at the top of the hierarchy in that community precisely because they have the best arguments, and they can rebut people from that are coming from other ideologies, and even convert people from other ideologies.
I just want to say, like, with this whole thing, like, I wasn't meaning to necessarily be dismissive before about people who fall into an ideology and get convinced by it, because like it happened to me when I was like 19, 20. And there definitely was like all the elements that you guys bring up of like people who are in the ideology being really good at arguing it. And Chris's point that you fall into a dominance hierarchy among the people of the ideology, and then like being clever within the ideology, or just being really fervent within the ideology, or being hardworking within the ideology, get rewarded, and all these things. So I get that process happens. I guess what I almost wonder is like if that process is necessary in a way, because I'm like listening to this like advice that we're giving, and I'm wondering like, if I was like 18 and when I was 18, I had like read all the critical thinking skills and all stuff like that. Like I knew what critical thinking was. I'd like studied it in school and stuff, but I almost wonder if you have to go through that, if it's a necessary part of like mental evolution or like self-evolution to like change your way of thinking, or like change who, like to rebel against who you were and become a new who you are. Mm-hmm. And then over time in that new who you are to like recognize the structures around you, to recognize how there's a high, because I went through that process even when I was still in it and I was still believing it. I was like, me and my friends would make jokes like, he's the king of the activists, and if this person does this and this and this, then they'll be the king of the activists. And you start to see the hierarchy, you start to see the cognitive biases, you start to see the things that people don't, you start to see in yourself and in the system of thought around you, like the patterns and the structures, and then through that you eventually transcend it. And I almost wonder if that has to happen in a way, or some kind of process. Maybe there's other ways. I don't know.
I'm inclined to agree with you. I mean, maybe it doesn't have to happen, but I don't know if I would be able to understand these things so deeply if I hadn't gone through the process of conversion into a reality tunnel and then transcending that reality tunnel. I'm not sure if it's necessary to have some kind of a construction phase, and build something solid before you can start trying to deconstruct everything. Or I don't know. I would be interested in seeing how or what a person was like, or if it was possible if they had never constructed any kind of belief system, but always came from this skeptical, many perspective state.
I think that thing that you were talking about, Ariel, earlier with, when you were 18 or 19 or something like that, you had learned about critical thinking, but still something was lacking. And I think that thing that was lacking was the ability to steel man the other side. I think it's tempting to straw man the other side and just say like, oh, that's a dumb argument because X, Y, and Z. But I think you do have to kind of do the process that Katie was talking about earlier, where you have to steel man the arguments. You have to really put yourself into the other side's position, and you have to argue as strongly as you can for it so that you can really make good arguments against it.
I wouldn't know. I would go even further than saying you need to steel man it. I would say that you need to create a part of yourself that believes it in order to be able to steel man it properly.
Yeah, I think that's kind of what I'm saying. Like, yeah, in order to steel man something properly, you have to some part of you needs to actually buy into it.
Maybe it's the process of dividing yourself. Because I feel like in some ways I did do that. Like when I was a teenager, I sort of realized I had just these beliefs I'd inherited, and someone gave me some counter arguments that were quite strong. I started researching the counter side. I just completely fell into the counter side, and I'm like, wow, the counter side is right. And then everything just kind of builds off of there. So, but in a way it was like, I was just fully in whatever I was in. Like first I was believing this fully, and then I was believing that fully. And then I was passionate about that. And it was like emotionally very attached to it. Mm. And I think with the first time that happens, it's easy to be like, wow, I was wrong before and now I'm right. Wrong, right. But then once that happens a few times, you're like, maybe it's more complicated than I was wrong and I was wrong and I was wrong and now I'm right.
Mm-hmm.
One thing, if somebody is in that position, like being an 18-year-old and starting to get involved in ideologies, I'd say that maybe, one thing for them to be aware of, even if they believe in something very strongly, they don't need to put it above other people. I think that's a mistake that a lot of ideologues make. Like they're like, well, this ideology is so important that I'm going to argue with people over it and maybe lose friendships over it or something like that.
Or even go so far as to say, this ideology is true, and if you don't believe in this ideology, then you're immoral, so I'm going to cut you off.
Yes. So that's I think that's stepping the line from ideologue into fanatic, I'd say.
Yeah.
I don't know, though. Isn't that just a part of... I almost think that never doing that, though, there's something lacking, too. It seems like it almost is an important stage in development to believe in something enough at a certain point that you're willing to make a big deal about it and to upset people and to lose people and to really assert that it's true. It seems like there's something about that is just pushing to the edge of passion and fervor.
Yeah, I think it's almost a trope of humanity that people in their teen years and their college years espouse crazy political ideologies, and then they have a process similar to you, Ariel, where they go, well, wait a minute, this has happened a few times, and I'm starting to see a pattern here. Maybe there's kind of a meta pattern, and that's when you hit the seventh circle and you go, aha.
Yeah, that's exactly what happened to me as well. I wanted to say too, Ariel, I think you're right that, okay, so question everything, including your questions, and break down all the ideologies, including even break down the idea of not having ideologies, maybe is a thing. When we're talking about cutting people off because of ideology, that sounds fanatical, but that's because there are some things that we believe in so strongly that we don't consider them ideology or programming. And I'm not trying to suggest this, but for example, I think that most of us would feel comfortable saying that it's not fanatical to end a friendship with somebody because they're a serial rapist or something like that, right? Because we hold this fanatical view that rape is wrong, so we're going to cut them off. To be clear, I don't think that's fanatical at all. I think that there are certainly things that are worth disassociating over, or even more. You don't want to get to a point that's so fanatically fanatical that you accept everything. Okay, so I wanted to move on to the next potential exercise for your Circuit 7. This one's a little bit more interesting, and I haven't practiced it myself, at least not in this kind of an extreme way, but I wanted to bring up the idea of maybe not just reading or listening to content of opposing viewpoints, but potentially spending some time embodying or playing a different character, kind of a la Jim Carrey in Jim and Andy. We have an episode on that if you want to. But basically what Jim did is he took on the character of Andy Kaufman for months and months during the filming of a documentary, biography documentary about Andy Kaufman. And in doing so, he really reshaped his identity and definitely changed up his reality tunnels. And I'm not necessarily suggesting that everybody should do something so extreme, but what do you guys think of this idea of playing characters and like really enacting that?
So it does remind me a lot of Aleister Crowley or Chaos Magic, where he's setting up he espouses setting up your life around a particular archetype, basically. I mean, you call them gods, but it's more about archetypes. Well, that's one way to look at it. So you set up your life so you have the colors that relate to this particular idea, and the flowers and the scents and the taste and the posters on your walls, or everything in your life is going to be somehow related to this idea. And then you try to change your language to get in sync with it as well. And so it's this way of deeply understanding an archetype. I don't think I've ever done that so intensely.
Mm. Neither have I. I've practiced improv and played different characters a little bit. I took an improv course, but I've never played a character for an extended period of time or set up my life to embody an archetype. But I think that might be like Circuit 7 next level, is not only creating these conceptual mental reality tunnels that you can kind of move between to analyze things from different perspectives, but actually living and breathing as through a different reality tunnel and kind of creating a different personality that you can tap into.
Yeah, I think there's, this reminds me of so many different things. The phrase "fake it till you make it," just like if you, or the avatar course or method or whatever it's called. I think they're kind of a similar idea where you picture this, as Kurt was saying, this archetype or this narrative. You kind of like write a story about yourself, write a backstory for your character, and then you just play that character. And over time, you start to identify with that character and you start to really understand him or her. And yeah, you can definitely use that to kind of push your behavior towards what you'd like it to be.
Okay, so I want to reevaluate. Actually, when you brought it up in that way, I have done something similar to this, and it did change me. I knew that I was shy and that I was kind of not very personable. So I thought the best thing that I could do if I want to become more well-spoken and confident and personable is to just throw myself into the woods and get a sales job. And in order to do that, I need to convince the people that are going to hire me that I'm a good salesperson. So I decided to act out the character. And I did. When I went into the interview, I kind of, I knew that I was acting. I was like, okay, how would a good salesperson act? And just act like that. And then I had to continue doing that at my job. Otherwise I wasn't going to eat. Right. So over the course of a year and a half or so, I think succeeded. It no longer was acting. I ended up incorporating some of those personality traits.
Yeah, I definitely can relate to wanting to become something and then just being like, okay, well, the only way to become good at this is to get experience doing this. And the only way to get experience doing this is by doing it as much as possible. And so actually one of the things that I want to be good at is teaching. And so I'm going to start teaching. I think that's how a lot of teachers start. They don't really know what they're doing, but eventually they kind of get the hang of it. So.
Cool. Okay. You brought up when you were talking about Aleister Crowley, Kurt, that part of that process is altering your language and language that you use. That's also a strategy that Robert Anton Wilson brings up for accessing Circuit 7, and also something that Timothy Leary mentions in his video. There seems to be a special role that language plays in programming our mind and programming our thoughts, because at least a lot of times for many of us, our thoughts are kind of processed through language. So like one example of a way that you could change your language would be, instead of saying, I have to do this, saying, I want to do this, or I choose to do this. Practice replacing that and see how that changes your mindset and the way that you interact with the world. Have you guys done anything like this, like toying with your language to change your mindset or who you are?
Yeah, I definitely try to do that one. I normally only say have to, and if I'm stating a conditional, like if I want to do this, then I have to do that, something like that. But like say if somebody says I have to go to my sister's wedding, I'll say, well, hang on, you don't have to. You're actually choosing to do it because it's something that's important to you. And yeah, I'm trying to adjust my own language that same way.
How do you feel like that adjustment has changed? Do you feel like it makes you appreciate the things that you're doing more, or feel less compelled, or has it changed your attitude in some way?
Yes, I think so. Another example that comes to mind is like people talk about maybe duties or responsibilities, obligations. I always try to say that things are opportunities. Like I was in a position when my friend Bob broke his arm, and I was going to stay with him, and that could be seen as a negative thing, because I'm like, I have to help him. I don't have to help him. I'm going to help him because of my friend, and it's an opportunity to do something wonderful for another human being. So yeah, I do think it, over the course of time, my feelings more aligned with the words.
That's interesting. And so I imagine that going into something like that with that attitude would actually resonate out to the other people in the interaction as well. Like, I'm sure if you had gone into it being like, oh, I have to go hang out with my friend Bob because he broke his arm, Bob probably would have felt that, and probably would have been like, oh, Kurt doesn't want to be here. But since you did want to be there, he probably felt that, like the love and friendship, positive aspects.
How do you guys feel like this relates to the concept of neurolinguistic programming?
Can you define neurolinguistic programming?
So I'm not an expert in neurolinguistic programming, but I think basically what NLP is about is this idea that our language controls our mindset. And well, a lot of NLP practitioners are specifically using it to manipulate other people. I think it's often kind of used for negative or mischievous purposes, but I think that you could also use those kinds of tools or tactics for good, kind of like what we're talking about.
I don't think a lot of people use NLP in that way. Maybe, but I think a lot of people get into it more from the frame of self-help, like how am I going to adjust my own thinking? But through doing that, you also learn that you can influence others' thinking as well.
Kind of the power of now type stuff?
No, so the power of now is about mindfulness meditation or presence meditation. Neuro-linguistic programming is the connection between your words and your thinking and your feeling, the connection between the way your words affect your perception of the world.
Yeah, I've always been a little bit confused about the difference between NLP and CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. And I do know that I'm not making any claims. I don't know much about it. But for what it's worth, NLP is considered to be a discredited strategy. Like there have been some studies that show it doesn't work, whereas like CBT seems to be a similar approach, but it's one of the most effective psychotherapies currently being practiced. So I don't think I know enough to really comment intelligently about, but it seems like they're both attempts to reprogram Circuit 7.
I'll give some examples. This might make things a little more clear. A lot of the time in our speech, we use analogies or metaphors, and sometimes they get so embedded that we're not even aware that we're making a metaphor or thinking about how the metaphor could actually affect our thinking, our perception, our feelings. So Tony Robbins gives this example where he's talking to one of his employees, and the guy says, "I just feel like I'm under so much stress. It's crazy. I feel like somebody's got a gun to my head and is about to pull the trigger." And Tony Robbins says, "Well, what color is the water gun?" And suddenly it puts it this whole different frame on the interaction, because it suddenly all the pressure is taken away. It's also like changing this guy's state because it's something that he really didn't expect. Or like I had colleagues of mine who were when we were working on a sales team, and one colleague of mine would always say, "How are the front lines?" And the metaphor is about war. It's like we're on one side and the customers are on the other side. And I know in some way that's going to affect his thinking, because it's like, it's not that we're trying to help the customer, it's that we're in a battle with a customer. And so if you think about it in another way, like, hey, I'm going to cooperate with this customer, I'm going to try to help them find value in the product. I don't know what metaphor you would use exactly, but it's like we're on the same team as our customers, something like that. It's a very different way of looking at things.
I was actually thinking about customer support yesterday when I noticed that one of my products had the word customer success on it instead of customer support. And I think that goes to the same idea as what you're talking about. It's like, oh, we're trying to help them succeed. We're not just like supporting them.
So I just wanted to say in response to that quick, like at least part of how I understand this, and whether we're talking about language or thought patterns or other things, it's not only that the way that you speak affects how you think, it's also the way that you think is reflective of how you speak. And I see it as more of a feedback loop. And so this effort to change your language is one tool that we have to potentially alter that feedback loop between like language and thought and reflection of thought and expression.
Oh, I actually wanted to ask Ariel. So you said that CBT is successful where NLP is not. Can you describe the differences between CBT and NLP?
No, I don't think I'm in a position to do that accurately right now. I'm just reporting, like, I just happen to know that mainstream science has done research on both, and NLP is not considered to be an effective therapy, whereas CBT is one of the most empirically supported therapies currently around. So I'm sure the NLP community has counter arguments to that, and I don't know them, so I don't think I can really comment beyond that.
It's like when part of it is when you take a belief and you can analyze it, you can look at how a certain trigger has a certain meaning in your mind, and you're trying to take that apart and ask questions, these logical questions about it, and try to analyze if the connection is real or just something you're projecting. So that's something what it's about.
And one thing about CBT that's interesting is it sets up this dichotomy between thought, feeling, and action. So that maybe fleshes out the feedback loop that Katie was just talking about a little bit.
Which is interesting. That's also very related to Stoic philosophy, is separating your feelings from your reactions and actions related to a feeling. It seems like a lot of these things have some commonality.
It comes from Stoicism.
Oh, okay. Well, that makes sense then. That actually ties really well into the next strategy that I wanted to talk about, which was thinking back to your imprintings in the lower circuits and thinking about how they may have impacted you, which is basically a lot of what you were saying, Kurt, analyzing your triggers and your memories and recognizing that behavior so that you can maybe try to interrupt that feedback loop if you feel like it's not serving you.
I don't know. It's interesting because it's almost like there's like two, like these different approaches kind of set out like a different kind of landscape for how to interact with yourself. Like the ones we were talking about before are more the like, you're trying to almost like condition yourself to be different. And then there's like the extreme one of trying to be a completely different person, which I've been trying to grapple with. And then there's another strategy of like self-knowledge and metaprogramming, where you go more deeply into yourself. Like you find out what all your imprints are, you find out what your triggers are, you find out who you really are more deeply, and then that somehow frees you to be more than you were before. And it seems like something about that tension, something about the idea of trying to be a completely different person, like to the point where it's like, because there's a difference between like being like, I'm going to be me, but I'm going to be a me that complains less, versus like, I'm going to be Chris for the day, you know, like just something completely different. Like it almost is like, it both seems like really like there's something seductive about it, but also something scary. I don't know why.
Yeah, I think this kind of goes back to what we were talking about before, where once you've experienced enough reality tunnels, you kind of realize the patterns that each one has a certain amount of truth and each one has a certain amount of falsity. And yeah, like once you've shifted around from and done these kind of like intentionally putting yourself into a different reality tunnel, you've done that enough times, you realize that none of them is completely correct, and there's no point in completely identifying with this reality tunnel or that reality tunnel. And I think the sort of fear or anxiety that happens when you think about sort of becoming somebody else has to do with identifying with your previous patterns of behavior. And I think when you can get over that, that sort of sense of identifying with your old belief systems, then that's when you can change. That's when you can make real change.
Yeah. And that's where I think there's some interesting stuff, because it's like, I think there's like a distinction between like accessing circuit 7 when it comes to your intellect versus accessing circuit 7 when it comes to your whole self. Because it's like circuit 7 can act on certain circuit 3, or it can act on all the previous circuits at once. And it's like where it comes to circuit 3 stuff, I'm very much now like, yeah, it's really good to experiment with different reality tunnels and to try this reality tunnel and that reality tunnel and to be intellectually polymorphous. But when it comes to like myself, I'm still very attached to like, but I'm myself. Like, this is who I am. And like, there's a part of me that like resists the idea of like playing around with different identities.
Yeah, and I think a lot of mastering circuit 7 is realizing that you are not the sum of your belief systems. You are something that's higher than that. I think I've been wanting to bring this up for a while now. I think so. A lot of the way that you can use circuit 7 is by analogy. So the mechanism of circuit 7 is you're taking yourself out of the equation, or you're putting yourself into the equation, however you want to look at it. And you basically say, well, what analogous situations have I seen where the person observing something, missed an important feature because they didn't notice that they were affecting things by being there. And so you can kind of zoom out and go to this higher level and be like, oh, that's what I thought was myself before. But really, that's just some process that I had started to identify with. And so I think circuit 7 is that mastering circuit 7 is mastering the process of zooming out one level and saying, oh, I'm actually not that thing. That's just a thing that I had programmed myself to believe that I was. But really, I'm something higher. To add to that, basically, a lot of ways that the most useful way to see yourself is by observing other people and drawing analogies between the sort of quirks and foibles and ways that other people stumble over things and other people are hurting themselves. Just draw analogies between other people and how you might be acting, basically using other people as a mirror.
I like to use that, like, say, if somebody does something that I find annoying, like, I think to myself, I wonder if I do that and I'm, actually annoying people. So I'll be more mindful of that.
Right. Yeah, other people can be models. A lot of what we're talking about in Circuit 7 is altering your own behavior to be more who you want to be, because you've recognized the way that your programming has impacted you and your metaprogramming, your reprogramming. So other people can be helpful models, but I also think that like looking deeply into yourself is really helpful as well, specifically like looking in your imprinting, looking in your past, because everybody's going to have unique triggers and flaws that are specifically come from their own life that like maybe it would be impossible to model in other people.
Well, what if we like recorded part of an episode where like we each switched which one we were?
That's like which person?
Which of us?
Oh, that sounds fun.
I don't know if I could do a good enough impression of y'all. Maybe I could.
I think we like maybe it would be good to like switch, like I don't know, like if I was gonna be Kurt, then Kurt would be me, and if Ariel was gonna be Chris, then like vice versa, and then you could just like Skype several times throughout the week to like study each other a little bit. Fine.
Sounds very involved.
But we just do it and see what happens. But yeah, we could also prepare like that.
Yeah, we could just try it. Yeah, we could totally just try it. I think that'd be a good exercise. Like, I really want to get into this character playing because I feel like that's a level of intensity of Circuit 7 practice that I haven't touched yet.
Yeah, me neither.
Okay.
Yeah, and going back to like mastering Circuit 7, I think a lot of mastering Circuit 7 is this process of realizing that you can be anyone you want this time around. Mm-hmm. It's like, if you see that you have a flaw or you see that you have a problem, or like there's this aspect that of yourself that you identify with, you're like, that's me and I don't like that, then you can change that. you can either just be somebody totally different and change your behavior, or you can change your mind so that you see that behavior as positive rather than negative. And yeah, so like instead of identifying with your past, you can identify with your future.
It gets complicated, right? Because Reiki talks about how sometimes like the things people don't like about themselves are the same things as the things they like the most. So it's like, oh, I'm so stubborn, it causes all these problems. But I'm really committed. I get stuff done.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that dichotomy is often true, that the most standout feature of any particular person is probably going to have positive effects and negative side effects, or we consider them side effects, but you know, they're probably equally effects. Like in my own personal case, I love that I'm a really deep thinker. I dislike that I'm very over analytical in every situation. But it is what it is, and I don't want to sacrifice that personality trait. And I don't think that you can change yourself, you can alter yourself, but I think it's hard to compartmentalize.
Yeah, I think part of like growing up and being an adult and maybe mastering the Circuit 7 is becoming comfortable enough with your flaws that you don't mind them, because those aspects of your personality are more positive than they are negative. And so if other people want to judge you for that, then it doesn't really affect you. You don't really care. You're just like, well, that's me, and I choose to be this way, and I'm happy with it.
That's one way to go with it.
Well, I think in a lot of situations, people can actually retain most of the positive aspects of having a character trait and minimize the negative aspects. So it is a very Circuit 7 metaprogramming thing, not being a slave to your nature, but actually being able to use your nature, knowing the right mode for the right situation. So I can be critical of myself and try to improve my behavior, but at the same time, I can give that part of me a break and say, well, I don't have to be hard on myself just because I offended somebody or whatever it was.
Yeah, like definitely both are important. Like both the method of like accepting yourself as you are and of trying to seek balance, like Kurt's saying. Like I remember like like a year ago, I like had a bad interaction with someone, and I was feeling bad about myself. My friend was giving me advice like, no, you're great the way you are and all that. And I was like, oh, that's good. I am great the way I am. But like later on, I went back and I was like, actually, that person had some good points about ways that I'm imbalanced, and I try to incorporate it. So it's because it's like if there's one part of you that's like overgrown, like you're hyper intellectual, and that's like a really important skill and it's useful, but it's also like you over intellectualize, then it's like you become imbalanced. You become like a tree with like a giant branch coming off of it, and like becoming a more balanced tree, like the whole thing can grow better.
So one of the great things about Circuit 7 is that you don't have to construct just one reality tunnel or one point of view. And I think this is a big theme of Prometheus Rising in general. And Robert Anton Wilson, is he talks a lot about like holding multiple perspectives and going back and forth between them. So you can at both times, like at the same time, cultivate self-love and self-acceptance and not beating yourself down about your flaws and stuff like that. But at the same time, also have another perspective where you recognize those flaws and you're working on them. Like go back and forth between the acceptance and the improvement, and the acceptance and the improvement, and enter that state at the times when it's appropriate.
Yeah, I think that aspect of Circuit 7 and sort of maturing as a person is one of the reasons why like long form conversations are becoming really popular on the internet now, and sort of these short-term conversations are not, because long-term conversations allow for nuance. They allow for a person to say like, well, sometimes I occupy this reality tunnel and sometimes I occupy this other conflicting reality tunnel. And, I'm not just like this, like equation that you can just put into a box, I have nuance to my identity. But, when you're having this political shouting match, that lasts for 2 minutes on cable news, there's no way for that nuance to really come out.
Okay, there's one more strategy I wanted to hit on in Circuit 7, like one more kind of overarching, maybe we could call it a meta strategy. And this is something that both Robert Anton Wilson talks about and also Timothy Leary talks about. Once I say what it is, it's probably going to be pretty obvious why Timothy Leary talks about. And that is thinking about the states in which you are most open to change and most able to change your mind. One of those particular states you can enter by taking LSD. And so I wanted to talk about LSD, psychedelics, or maybe not even psychedelics. You can also enter some kind of a trance meditative state, but basically these altered open states of consciousness, specifically LSD, and how utilizing those altered states can help us with the metaprogrammer. What do you guys think?
Absolutely. And I would mention one other one, and it's shamanism. And Vervaeke talks about that at length, how psychedelic trips can be very much like just the ancient shaman, putting on the deer costume and just getting it like doing breathing, exercising and chanting and shouting and just getting into this altered state of consciousness, which triggers that Circuit 7.
It reminds me of what Kurt was talking about at Circuit 5 of like choosing that you really want to be happy, and then figuring out creating the conditions to be happy, and then letting go of the desire to be happy. And it seems very analogous to that. Almost maybe competitive with that. Like, I don't know. I don't know. How do you guys think those systems interact?
Well, I would say that something like LSD or being in some kind of altered state of consciousness is part of the process of creating the conditions for those things to happen. I mean, one, because the experience itself will take you to a very meta state, but two, because like on a neurological level, you're just simply more neuroplastic when you're tripping. So if you want to reprogram your mind, if you safely and intentionally have some kind of a psychedelic trip, that can like just literally reprogram yourself much more quickly and much more impactfully than you could if you weren't on a substance like that.
Yeah, I think it goes back to, I think the power of those states goes back to what I was talking about earlier, where you can use metaphors to understand yourself. Obviously on LSD, your brain is very good at drawing these these analogies between very disparate things. And so, yeah, you're constantly being like, oh, is that how I do things? And then you try to compare and contrast, the thing that you've experienced with the thing that's going on in your mind. And you try to see if there's some truth to it. And then you can use that to heighten your awareness and change how you see reality and bring yourself to a higher state of being, make yourself more happy, make other people more happy.
During ayahuasca ceremonies, people try to select the music very carefully because obviously it's a very sensitive time when you're vulnerable and you can be imprinted. So I'd be curious if people invent other types of brainwashing schedules, like maybe you could send out eight hours of films or something, or motivational material or something like that, and drop acid and then see what comes out the other side.
Yeah, that's
that's basically electronic music festivals, right?
Yeah,
kind of.
Right.
But I mean, electronic music festivals, it's like you're really engaging with music. It's super stimulating, but I think it's different. Like I've actually had that idea, like for a psychedelic trip, I'd really like to lay out a schedule of media and experiences that I want to influence me and go through that so that I can become more what I want.
Oh yeah, if you want to be influenced by a particular piece of media, drop acid and then experience that piece of media. It will hit you as hard as it possibly can.
I still want to try learning a language from scratch on an LSD trip.
Yeah, I haven't done it from scratch, but like my last LSD trip, I went from having very choppy Spanish with vocabulary to coming out with the same amount of vocabulary, but with like fluency with the level of vocabulary that I had because I was speaking Spanish for 24 hours. Another thing that I intentionally did, which I think has positively impacted me, is I was painting and I was feeling very self-conscious that like my art wasn't to the level of the other people who were painting on this shared mural. So I was like, oh, I don't deserve to take up space. And then I had a moment where I was like, you know what? No, it is pretty good and people are appreciating it. And like, even if it's not, this is a public space. It's okay to take up space. And then I started painting like affirmations, like take up space in the world and things like that. And I really think that that experience has been a big part of what's given me the courage to like do things like this show.
Don't try drugs at home, kids.
Don't do drugs. Drugs are illegal and drugs are bad and dangerous. And this is for entertainment purposes only. And everything I just said was a lie about myself.
You were stepping into a character. That's what you were trying to say.
Yes, I was assuming a character.
Yes, now I'm having the urge to give a more serious warning because that's what my character was like.
That's true.
But anyway,
I was channeling her inner Timothy Leary.
Yeah, there should be a real warning.
This is like my circuit for speaking, but I actually do think you should exercise caution before doing psychedelic drugs and acid in particular. I've known a lot of people that have had psychotic breaks on acid, and it definitely you want to, if it's something you're considering doing, you want to make sure you're in a stable psychological state and you have good friends and you've done some work on yourself and you probably have some circuit 7 experience before going into it.
That what you're getting is actually the substance that you think you're consuming. That's a big part of it too.
Yeah. And psychedelics are a bit like fire.
Online. What are those tests called?
Yeah, like you're kind of like playing with fire. So you can burn yourself. Or you can have a nice warm campfire that provides happiness to your life and others.
Yeah, I think that's a really good thing to say is like we're talking about the impact of psychedelic experiences and how they can imprint you. I mean, yeah, psychedelic experiences are impactful and they can imprint you. Like that can also go very poorly. That can go very, very poorly.
Okay, do we want to move on to Circuit 8, guys?
I think it's time for Circuit 8.
Great. Circuit 8, Wilson calls it the non-local quantum circuit. This is a state of consciousness where your perception of information isn't bound by space or time. So you might think of things like remote viewing or out-of-body experiences. Some ways you can access this will be through certain yogic states, such as Kundalini awakening or Samadhi Awastha, which is this high yogic state in which you're not aware of your body at all, near-death experiences, and psychedelic drugs which can give an ego death, such as DMT, high-dose LSD, and ketamine. So one thing I read suggested that for a person to achieve samadhi avasta or other certain yogic states, they'd have to be celibate for 12 years and practice diligently every day. So what level of discipline do you think is necessary to achieve a state like this or come into contact with this circuit?
I was going to say, I think that there's the way to achieve this circuit more naturally through discipline and through practice. And then I think that there are also chemical hacks to reach this circuit. And I don't know that, well, I would suspect that people who reach it through chemical hacks are less likely to be ready for it, or maybe it's more possible that they could have negative experiences with it. Or if you build your way up to it without drugs, I'm sure that you need to have like a lot of context and understanding to even get to that point. Otherwise you wouldn't be able to constructively get there. So it's probably a little bit more dangerous and maybe not as rich if you get there chemically, as opposed to like maybe someone who had that practice and also utilized the chemicals.
Yeah, I would say the way that I understand this circuit is kind of by analogy through the crown chakra. In yoga, there's a system of chakras that starts at the base of your spine, and there are 7 or 8 or however many, all the way to the top. Top of your head is called the crown chakra. And so the practice of yoga is basically, you're supposed to practice opening each of these chakras in succession. You're supposed to start by trying to open the lower ones, and then you're supposed to try to open the upper ones. And then finally, you're supposed to try and once you've mastered opening all of the other lower ones, then you're supposed to work on this higher one. And so that's kind of how I see the 8th circuit. It's this, pure, connectedness to the whole universe, ego death experience, where basically this is what people are talking about when they talk about God. Like you're just directly communing with the divine. And assuming such a thing exists, yeah, it seems like the most difficult circuit to access. And you probably have to have some level of mastery over the other ones before you can get there. And as Katie said, I'm sure you can sort of shortcut the process by using chemicals, but I think there are people who are very disciplined, probably, who have specific meditation practices or breathing practices or something like that to get them into this state, and that's probably healthier. Whenever I reach a state using drugs, I try and if it's a good state and I want to get there again, I try and work on accessing that state without drugs, because drugs strike me as unnatural and maybe, I don't know, more dangerous.
Yeah, it's like if you can get there without it, maybe you can get there without having as much risk.
Yeah, exactly.
Or in just a deeper way. I don't want to totally down drugs though. Like I question if it even is possible to have something like a DMT experience without drugs, without DMT.
I think there are historical examples of exactly that. If you look, just look at like St. Paul and his road to Antioch or wherever he was going to persecute Christians, where he just had this kind of spontaneous, all right, so this was a special case where I don't think he was trying to get into any particular state, and something just kind of smote him, and he ended up in this, metanoia, and he had a complete change of heart, and he became a Christian and started evangelizing. I think there are, I think the reason why the practice of yoga exists, basically, like this, accessing this circuit is basically the purpose of yoga, is to reach samadhi, as Kurt was mentioning.
Also, I don't think it's fair to assume that our historical spiritual figures did not use psychedelics.
Yeah, some people speculate things like, people say that Christianity is actually a mushroom cult. They also say like when Moses was wandering in the desert and they've found the manna, which appeared to have dropped from heaven. The manna was actually mushrooms that had popped up overnight.
Interesting.
I mean, also it's there's a lot of people, it's not even super conspiracy, like many people think that Greek philosophers were utilizing some kind of a psychedelic. There's references to it.
This is all very interesting, but all of these experiences we're talking about, like Moses, St. Paul, the Greek philosophers, like this all strikes me as primarily circuit 6-7 experiences. And so I'm wondering, like, where you guys, like, do you guys see examples of circuit 8 historically, or like how does it get back to circuit 8?
Oh, I was going to say that I think that the case of the Buddha and enlightenment is almost, it seems to be almost exactly like what Wilson is talking about. This experience of oneness or connectedness with the whole, or with the divine, or with whatever you want to say. I think that is the concept of enlightenment.
Yeah. Well, I think, Ariel, you're making that distinction because it does seem like Wilson, the way he describes it, he's specifically talking about a state in which you can receive information. And I guess you could argue that you could kind of argue both sides with the Buddha. Like, did he receive information, or was he just entering a state which had insight about himself, or something like that? I guess you could look at it both ways. So you could consider that 5 and 6, or you could consider it 8.
In the case of the Buddha, it seems like 8 to me, but in the case of the other ones, it seems more like the metaprogrammer and some archetypal. Maybe Moses. There might be, that one could be interpreted in a circuit 8 way. But the other two, the Greek philosophers and St. Paul, definitely seem like circuit 7 to me.
So the theory behind this circuit is that you're actually connecting to this like cosmic information network, or this cosmic consciousness, or this cosmic intelligence. And I don't think there's any way to really prove that actually happens. And the only way that you can know that somebody has accessed this state is if they feel like that has happened, I would say. And so when Moses says, well, I went to the top of the mountain and there was this burning bush and the voice of God spoke to me, I would say that he was accessing circuit 8 in as clear of a way as can be demonstrated.
Yeah, that's fair. There are certain terrestrial things which we can test. So if you do out of body experiences, I know in some emergency rooms they will do things like they'll put a particular thing on the top shelf, which is a place where somebody who's lying down on the operating table or whatever, they can't see it. So the doctor will ask them later, so, you're saying you left your body during this near-death experience. What did you see on top of the shelf? Which is, it's kind of I have a lot of criticisms about that, but it's one way you could test something like that.
Yeah, I think it is important to bring up some skepticism here. Like, another thing that we could say is perhaps people who claim to have experienced circuit 8 have actually experienced psychosis.
Yeah, or maybe you could say, like, circuit 6 and circuit 7 are obviously active. Like, they have to be active while you're accessing circuit 8. And I think maybe that's because you're doing something to combine circuit 6 and circuit 7 in order to get into circuit 8. For instance, I think God is an archetype, and this kind of overmind idea is an archetype. And I think that reflecting on that using circuit 7 would probably be the path to get into circuit 8.
And like, for me, interesting, like when I think of circuit 8, and I wouldn't say that I've fully experienced circuit 8, but I think that I've grazed it. But when I think about circuit 8, I don't think about God at all. It doesn't even enter into it. Perhaps because I don't really have an archetype for God that's like active in my psyche. But I do think about, I think about the universe. I think about the fact that, we're all made up of particles, which are maybe waves, which are and like maybe everything is the same medium, and like connecting with that greater perspective. But I don't think it has to be about God.
Well, I think the idea of God is what you said. It's kind of like this substrate of the universe, with the addition that it's intelligent. It has some kind of purpose and direction.
Right. And I don't for me, I don't think about it that way. I don't believe that that's true. I don't know, maybe I could take on that perspective, but
Yeah, I bet if you did think about it that way, you might access circuit 8.
Well, I don't think that do you have to think about it that way to access circuit 8? That seems a little bit
Maybe.
close-minded.
I mean, so Wilson talks about in circuit 7 that you can see circuit 7 as this kind of omniscient computer where you can ask it any question and it knows the answer. I think that's an important component of, well, mastering circuit 7 and possibly getting into circuit 8.
Well, it's an important component of Wilson's perspective on mastering circuit 7 and possibly getting into circuit 8.
Yeah, there's like different ways to look at accessing circuit 8. Like you could look at it as like accessing like a divine superordinate intelligent principle, which is like the idea of God. And that's what and communing with that is the ultimate deepest experience of reality. You could look at it like communing with the fundamental harmony and order of the universe is the fundamental experience, that the universe is ordered, but it's not intelligent. Or you could look at it like it's all chaos. Like there's all these ordered principles leading up to 1 through 7. They're just human constructions. And when you get to circuit 8, you experience the disordered, unintelligent, messy chaos of reality at the deepest level. And there's just nothing there beyond that.
Yeah, and I think that's a pretty dark place to go.
Doesn't seem dark to me.
I mean, circuit 8, it kind of depends because like people like I've experienced both. Like I've experienced a circuit 8 experience that felt ordered, and I've experienced circuit 8 experiences that felt chaotic. And it's not clear if one was a genuine circuit 8 experience and one wasn't, or if they were both aspects of reality.
Can I ask you which one you enjoyed more?
I don't know. Like, I guess I'll just, to be clear, when I was younger, I used to do ketamine, and sometimes I would go into the K-hole, and that's where there's experience of reality that felt very, very chaotic and unpatterned. But like, it was like still like an ego death experience. Like I'd forget who I was, or like sometimes I would have moments where I was like, whoa, like I'm 84. And then I would remember and like, no, actually I'm 20 something. And but I feel like I could never really trust the things I would see or think, because I began to suspect that it felt like with ketamine, like it'll tell you truth, but it'll also tell you lies, and it just has no relationship to truth. And it was interesting, but I wouldn't say enjoyable. And then the one that felt ordered was on 5-MeO-DMT, which is like you vibrate on it, and you basically like, it's like your body like straightens out, and it feels like you start to like vibrate, and it's like all the parts of you that are like cramped or like they all like straighten out, and you become perfectly symmetrical. And it's like it just feels like you're just like physically harmonizing along this pattern. And it's also an ego death experience.
Whoa.
Can we talk about remote viewing and out-of-body experiences? Has anybody had out-of-body experience?
I've had experiences where I didn't feel connected to my body, but I've never had an experience where I felt above my body. I have had experiences where I felt like I couldn't control my body, or like I was disconnected from it in some way. But honestly, for me, those experiences just that's what happens right before I get a panic attack.
Okay. That's I guess more like dissociation.
Maybe, yeah.
Yeah, that sounds like the negative aspect of circuit 5 almost.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I've had an out-of-body experience. I think that specifically refers to the experience of seeing yourself from outside of yourself.
No, not necessarily. it's a very broad term. So it could be you're seeing yourself. You could see something else in this world. You could see something else from another realm.
Yeah, I've had a couple of similar experiences that I accessed in very different ways. The first one was the first time I ever did nitrous oxide. And the second time was when somebody put me in a chokehold. I guess both of them were kind of oxygen deprivation. And in both experiences, I felt time and space just melt away. And I felt like there was this tunnel that I was flying through. And I felt like millions of years passed by. It didn't feel very ordered. It felt more chaotic, I would say.
My circuit four is... I was going to say my circuit four is chiming up and saying we should say something about ketamine and nitrous in terms of disclaimers.
Yeah, I don't think people should. Nitrous is really bad for your brain, and ketamine can cause problems in your body too. I would advise people against taking those. It's interesting. Is that enough?
I've only
Yeah, that's probably enough. I don't know.
Yeah,
nitrous is pretty safe as recreational drugs go, but I'm not recommending that anybody do it.
people sometimes suffocate on the balloon and stuff. Anyway,
that's not from the nitrous. That's from the suffocation.
it causes oxygen deprivation. Anyway, do your own research before doing stuff. It's
I
interesting
tried
though.
nitrous once. I don't recommend it. It's not fun for me. So
Some people find it fun, but
yeah.
I would say though, like an interesting contrast between like ketamine and nitrous and 5-MeO-DMT is ketamine and nitrous both cause lax. Like ketamine causes parts of your brain that normally communicate to stop communicating, and parts of your brain that normally communicate with your body to stop communicating. And so your brain becomes more like something in your brain that usually is connected becomes isolated versus like 5-MeO and it's similar in nitrous, but in 5-MeO-DMT, it's the opposite. Like it causes like massive neural activity and connectedness, and it causes like the rapid proliferation of like new brain cells.
Same with LSD or psilocybin.
Yeah, and so I don't know what that tells us about the fundamental reality or nature. Like I don't know how that helps us evaluate the truth conditions of each one, but I'd be interested what you guys think the implications of that are.
Well, I don't know. I don't know about the implications in terms of the reality, but like at least personally, some personal implications are like I'm definitely not interested in trying any substance which disconnects my body from my brain or stops parts of my brain from communicating.
To some extent, that's what cannabis does too, and alcohol.
I mean, that's what going to sleep does.
Interesting.
It's not inherently a dangerous state to be disconnected from your body. But yeah, I understand the trepidation.
It's not actually disconnecting. It's just causing more like a rush of GABA in certain centers, which basically prevents certain pathways from firing that would usually fire.
Okay. I wonder if that somehow relates to this idea that you said that the K-hole felt unpatterned and the 5-MeO-DMT felt ordered and patterned. The one thing about psychedelics is they kind of like psychosis or like other things, they stimulate you to recognize more patterns. And it makes sense based on what it's doing neurologically, but it seems like it also makes sense based on what ketamine is doing to your brain that it would cause the breakdown of patterns that you normally perceive.
Yeah, I mean, I think what ketamine and other dissociatives are doing is, they're disconnecting your brain from your body so that you can just sit there and contemplate your own mind. And that's probably why it feels less ordered, because you're just this island. Whereas when you become more connected to external reality, you're seeing patterns about that. And I don't know, I guess I could see going deep inside yourself and disconnecting from external reality as possibly, I could see how that might that could be ordered, but
it doesn't feel like contemplation. It doesn't even feel like you're able to like carry out rational thought anymore, really.
yeah, it's just like this stillness, I guess, kind of like deep meditation.
No, it's not like that either. It's all moving, but it's like, it's chaotic and unreliable.
I was going to say, from what I've heard, it's just really weird, and just a really weird, intense, completely out of control, chaotic, bizarre experience.
It kind of sounds like this state that sometimes I get in when between dreaming and waking, and I'm having a dream, but it's not clear at all what the dream is about. Like everything is entirely abstract. There's not really anything I could call an image, or nothing that exactly relates to any of my normal five senses. Is that something what it's like?
Yeah, that sounds a lot closer to what it's like. Yeah.
Yeah, so ketamine is dissociative. It acts on the same pathways as things like nitrous and DXM and salvia, and these tend to be experiences that I don't enjoy. Yeah,
it's similar effects. It's not quite the same. It has similar effects, but it's not really it's not quite the same pathways in each case.
Yeah, I think they all have the same effect, that they disrupt your motor function, which is the disturbing thing about it, because normally you're connected with your limbs and you can move and stuff, and they tend to paralyze you or numb you, which is disconcerting.
I don't like this idea at all.
But I mean, so does alcohol, though.
True. Yeah.
I've also never been wasted. I've also never gotten really drunk.
You definitely can't get to the 8th Circuit on alcohol.
But yeah, okay, maybe that's an interesting question. Like, what is that? Like, what is that state? When the state where you're like extremely drunk on alcohol? Like, how do we understand that state relative to the circuits? Maybe it is circuit 8.
I'd say you go into a sort of state 1 or state 2 because you revert to this very basic, almost bestial nature, or you can. I guess it depends on the person.
I would say it's a little bit circuit 5, because kind of like cannabis, it kind of just relaxes you and makes you stop thinking about it. Kind of damages your memory, like temporarily or permanently, depending on how much you do. And it brings down your inhibitions. It makes you, it kind of turns down the volume on your anxiety and your fear.
For me, I've never gotten really drunk, but I do feel like the more alcohol I drink, like if I'm relatively tipsy, it feels like everything is still there. Like all of my processes, my logic, my inhibitions are still there, but like something is just interrupted where I can't follow a thought through to its conclusion, or I forget things easily. So I can just more naturally enter like an uninhibited kind of flow state and take things as they come. And you're also like literally wobbly and disconnected, and you can't be as precise. Actually, it just kind of feels like everything that I like to do with my brain and my body is, I don't know, like everything's just kind of stretched out and I forget it, or I'm just not able to coordinate as well. But it's fun if you let go.
As far as drug warnings go, and it's worth noting, alcohol is one of the most dangerous drugs in existence.
Yeah, definitely don't do alcohol at home, kids.
Yeah, but particularly getting like really drunk, you can die pretty easily. So
many people do.
Yeah.
So I want to get back to what alcohol maybe helps with. In Impro, Keith Johnstone talks about spontaneity, and he talks about a lot of times the challenge that people have with spontaneity is they're constantly thinking about the significance of whatever they create, and they're worried that it might be obscene or ugly or something like that. And alcohol gets you to just not think about that because I think it it like deactivates that part of your brain that reads significance into things.
When I was learning to freestyle rap, I would take a couple of shots beforehand to try to loosen myself up.
I was going to say, for me, it doesn't feel like I stop thinking about the significance of things. Maybe this is just my nature. And maybe this is why I don't like getting really drunk, is because it feels frustrating. It feels like I'm trying to think about the significance of things, but then I lose the thought. I don't know. It doesn't feel like things are deactivated. It just feels like everything's kind of dampened and harder to access and harder to stick with.
Sounds like you need to just chill out when you're on alcohol and just go with it.
How to Get Abducted in Mexico by Chris Quinn.
No, it's not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you're in a situation that might be dangerous, then alcohol is definitely not your friend.
Yeah.
So with quantum mechanics and some interpretations of quantum mechanics, the idea is that there is non-local information in the universe. So how does this relate? So does it actually mean if we activate this higher circuit of ourself, we can actually tap into information anywhere?
Robert Anton Wilson seems to think so. He calls this the non-local quantum circuit.
Yes.
I mean, that's kind of like the fundamental question before all of this is like, are these experiences actually is Circuit 8 even a thing? Like, is it actually like we're experiencing something deep about reality, or are our brains just fucked up on drugs, screwed up on drugs?
Well, I was going to mention my out-of-body experience earlier, in which I was sober. So it's not necessarily about being messed up on drugs. I was meditating and I tried to ascend several planes. I couldn't see anything, and I was calling out with my mind, "Oh, can someone open my third eye so I can see something?" And suddenly I saw this figure and he started to introduce himself. It looked like I was in the Matrix, and this is sort of two-dimensional figure looking like an old Japanese painting of a rat, and it said, "Hello, I am the Rat Buddha." And I was like, what in blue blazes is going on? I was so alarmed that I came back to my body, and there was no change in consciousness. It's not like I was suddenly dreaming and then awoke or something like that. It was all smooth and all consistent, but it is very interesting and also very alarming.
Bert, your brain is great. I never cease to be amazed by your brain. Okay, so
Okay,
hang on. So I think what Wilson would say is that Circuit 8 is a higher circuit than Circuit 3. Circuit 3 is